So in a sense, you can take this triad, like the evolutionary triad,
Yeah.
variation, selection, inheritance, and technically you don't have a habit until you have inheritance.
Yeah.
But in a way, you can say there's a kind of ordinality. You can kind of say, well, there's variation, not there are variations. That was almost the wrong way of saying it because
Yeah. Yeah.
that's already determinable or definite, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's like
Right.
there is concrete possibility, which is
Yeah.
under determination, which is creativity for Whitehead. I
Mm,
take it, right? Then there are constraints
mm,
that operate in some sense on what that variational process. And in fact, those constraints are how you get the first variants or variables,
mm,
because there are no variables without constraints, right?
yeah.
There's just variation or just underdetermination. There's
Mm,
just concrete possibility, which is just it, not it. There's no it. It's
yeah.
just change.
Yeah.
It's some abstract because and this is all very abstract, right? It's Dure, I guess, as this abstract thing. And then because some variants are more persistent than others, you have habit or inheritance, right? And so that's why Peirce will say something like, you know that natural selection, when you take the whole thing, is essentially it's not a logical tautology, but it's basically a tautology. That which is good at persisting tends to persist. And I don't think he's saying that's a bad thing. He's saying this is exactly the kind of principle you would want if you were going to start reasoning about why in a universe in which he says variation is the most obtrusive character of reality,
Yeah.
why we nonetheless see clumps of variation, why we
Mm,
actually
mm.
do see, determinate or definite forms. And I mean, I have some of the same differences that I feel like I've had with Bergson, but I really appreciate him, and I think that obviously I've been very into people who were heavily, heavily influenced by him.
Mm, mm.
That includes pretty much any subsequent process philosopher, right? I mean,
Yep.
including obviously Whitehead, including James at the time, but clearly the French guys who I have spent quite a bit of time with. And I like a lot of his. I mean, I feel this way about Rouillet as well, and probably a lot of these guys. That the way they diagnose problems, their critical analysis, the way they set things up is often just so incredibly lucid, but I'm generally less impressed by their solutions.
Mm. Okay.
Um, and there's like a degree, and again, I can't get into it without going over the notes, but there's a kind of degree of like, I don't know, forcing a solution still, and there's a lot of rhetoric in the way that
Mm.
and that's hard to avoid. So I'm not saying that I've done anything better, but I tend to be more impressed by their criticism than by their positive philosophy, so to speak. But that's philosophy in general, almost.
Fair.
Um,
Well, I'm curious. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on Rie, but maybe we should wait for that and stick to Bergson. So, I mean, what about Bergson in
oh,
particular do you
I mean,
feel like
yeah. Well,
let
like I said,
down, or specifically with the possible that
well,
text?
Well,
Yeah.
like I said, having not gone over my notes and having been really sick subsequently,
Yeah.
I
Fair.
don't have all that in my working memory. I mean, I tend to think that this is going to be now a massive sweeping generalization, but I've actually been thinking about Hegel in the last couple of days and
Uh,
the opening of the logic, and listening to Stephen Houlgate's lectures on that. And I've got his book, The Opening of Hegel's Logic, which I'd read a bit of previously.
Interesting. Yeah.
I do think there's something like profoundly right about what Hegel's doing, but then also something profoundly wrong at the same time. And maybe this is just a good place to start the conversation and make it really general. But there's an equation of thinking with being, basically, and we can say it's the Parmenidean thing, right? But there's this idea that to quote Bergson, but it's also Hegel, through intuition. And so, Hegel rejects Kant's separation between, like, intuition is sensuous and the intellect is not intuitive. And Hegel's like, no, the intellect is intuitive as well.
Hmm.
Uh, that equation of what we can intuit in a very necessary, worthwhile, and valuable um, exercise practice. So I think what Hegel is describing at the beginning of the Logic is a form of contemplative practice, which is extremely valid,
Mm,
which I think is something that I do talk about myself all the time in different
mm,
ways. But then to go from there to basically say that because you've gone to the most underdetermined, basically, or the
mm.
most indeterminate possible
Yeah.
experience, that you've actually reached the point where thought and being are the same.
Mm,
And then if you're just, you know, careful enough and diligent enough to stop all of your presuppositions coming back in, that you can allow the logic
mm.
of I mean, it's the labor of the concept in Hegel, right? But you can allow it to kind
Mm.
of unfold and reveal
Yeah.
its. I mean, I think in a way there's a little bit. It'd be interesting to hear what you think because you know Bergson so much better than I do. But I think there's a little bit of that in Bergson as well.
Interesting. I would not
Mm.
peg that on Bergson, but well, I'm curious about what you mean by thought. So, like, thought equals being kind of question.
Mm.
I mean, in Hegel or more generally, um, I mean, I would break thought into multiple modalities or something like that, which is kind of what I've been doing in this
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
ongoing
yeah,
research project from China.
yeah.
Because you have explicit active
Mm.
thought like dianoia in the Greek sense where you're like thinking through things with representations, and there's something more than representations there too, partially principles, partially the structure of the thinking itself, which is kind of like a dynamic morphological almost unity to thinking. uh,
Mm.
well, and then the other person I think of when you bring this up with Hegel is Spinoza. And I think
Yes.
that for Spinoza, there is a reading where being and thought are equal, but I would say that there's a reading where they're not necessarily
Mm.
equal, and you can like have. I mean, that's kind of where Deleuze tries to go with his reading of Spinoza, and I'm kind of in favor of like the destabilizing to some
Yeah,
degree of the parallelism.
yeah,
Or you could just say that there's areas of either side of the parallelism that are inaccessible for whatever reason, but this parallelism like maintains. So that gets us back to the other question. But I guess the other piece of, yeah, I guess to wrap this up and hear what you have to say, like I would say that there's a kind of latent intelligibility, as you know, I like this term,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that is not under the form of an idea. So it's not the pre-existence of determinacy of
Mm.
thinking,
Mm.
even though it has like a definiteness in a Whiteheadian sense, um, in
Okay.
terms of what is determinable. So
Yeah,
it has a
yeah.
definiteness that is determinable into thoughts,
Mm.
but as kind of a virtual, uh, you know, pre-articulated, underdetermined uh, intellectual reservoir or something like that. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I think this is what Hegel thinks too.
and there, I
And
would say too that like thought goes beyond being in a certain sense in that
uh,
way. And then there
okay.
are ways that being can go beyond thought, but we can maybe get to or
Well,
existence if we're
yeah.
not. Yeah,
So, I
but
mean, I would almost want, if I were to get more to my own sort of positive conception or whatever, which is mostly negative, but has some positivity to it, I hope. I would probably just substitute some of those, like, the category of being with the category of reality anyway,
yeah,
and reality with a small r. And this is
yeah,
where I would bring in, when I'm thinking about the relationship of thought and basically experience and imagination and all of this stuff, like psyche
yeah.
with reality. I'm a full-on psychic realist,
Mhm.
as like that's all real. So there's something about Parmenides that I'm accepting, but I read
Right.
Parmenides in a very strange way. Like I prefer to think of him less as a kind of classical metaphysician, even if he is setting up something that is a precursor to that, and more as just like a shaman.
Yeah.
Um, but it's like, yes, you can't think what's not real in the sense because as soon as you've thought something, it is real, like so that is an
Yeah.
aspect. But to me, that's an aspect of reality. It's not coextensive with reality. And
Mm.
that's why we have for me, and we could also get into this at some point, but we have different stances we take towards reality. Like we have the reality of things that we immediately experience, which I call prosaicness.
Mm,
We have realities as revealed through inquiry, and that's through specific and precise methodological bracketings of
mm,
elements of prosaicness so that we can, get precise, methodological, and we can make certain kinds of interventions and all of that. So effective theory and all of that obviously goes in there. And then we have, speculation. And because of the difference between prosaicness and inquiry and the fact that they do in fact reveal different aspects of reality and can't simply be mapped onto one another even
mm.
though they're obviously very interdependent.
Yeah,
uh, and what we discover in inquiry transforms the possibility of experience, but
yeah,
also no inquiry without
yeah.
prosaic experience,
Well,
right? So,
isn't there too like a level between or that prevents that movement that you're exactly
yeah.
describing, where we do kind of like get caught up in unreal, at least a little bit unreal, where we cut things out from the rest of the world and we say that this is a whatever, and then I mean, because like the big move for Bergson or for phenomenology is to say the initial way that we experience things is a hurdle to doing any
Yeah.
kind of deeper inquiry into the
Yeah.
psyche or into experience or whatever. Um, and like I've been reading a lot of Brentano. Did I tell you that I've been reading a bunch of Brentano? And
You
he uses
mentioned.
this term like the irreal.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about fantasy or even like internal time consciousness, I hear a sound and then it fades, but it's still there, in that retentional. And I
Yeah.
talked about this a bit in my talk in China, the kind of like latent intelligibility of retentional content. He would call some of that like irreal. Or you
Yeah.
could think, and the way that this later become like Sartre uses this term a bunch, um, and so does Husserl, but like an actor when they're playing a part, they like irrealize uh
Mhm.
the fantasy of and in a way they irrealize their normal self in order to create this like
Yeah.
fantasy
Yeah.
self. So
Yeah. Yeah.
uh
They suspend its reality in a way, right? I mean,
yeah, well, it's at least not something actual,
yeah.
and even as a kind of anticipatory or memory or whatever kind of non-actual part of the present moment in consciousness, has some kind of irreal quality to it. I don't know. I'm just diving into this word real, and
Yeah. No,
yeah,
I like, and unfortunately I changed it because
mm,
I'd recently made, and now I can't find the note because all I remember is that I had, I make too many notes and I lose track of them. But
yeah,
I was for it because I used spontaneously used, and I don't know where it came from. I mean, it's been a word I've been aware of, but the word irreal in one of my notes recently, but I think I changed it to unreal for some reason.
mm,
Um, and I think there's going to be a difference there.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, we do all kind things are not the reason I want to say like whatever you can think of experience and also whatever are the conditions, so latent intelligibility and all of that as well of your experiences is real, is because I don't think people get into all these arguments about what's real and what's not real, and I just don't think they're interesting arguments. I
yeah,
think what's interesting are the different conditions of
yeah,
realization, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm basically interested in like genetic arguments of different kinds, right? Or genetic accounts.
yeah,
Like, what are the conditions of this reality?
yeah,
And then that also becomes an account of its kind of its efficacy, right? So reality is power or reality is efficacy, right? It's the capacity to make a difference in some
yeah,
way. And giving a genetic account
mm,
or an account of the conditions of realization of some, real element, whatever that you've identified, will also tell you like you're situating it in a sort of network of relations, synchronic and diachronic, and
Mhm.
then you're talking about how it can interact and what it can interact, and also its availability.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of real experience that I have that you don't have.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that, it's not real just because
Yeah.
it's not available in the same way as it is to me, to
Mhm.
you, to other people. It
Mhm.
just means that its conditions of realization are such that it has an element of like privateness to it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I mean, I would say that the unreal just doesn't exist, or you
yeah,
just have like a
yeah,
a
yeah,
thought that kind of points at something that doesn't exist. But the
yeah,
irreal
yeah.
does have a efficacy, although it's always, in a substrate, and that substrate is a mental act of some sort, or resonance between perceptual content and the uh, attitude that we have towards it. And I mean, I wanted to also bring in existence again because I mean, I think that uh, intelligence can exist on one level while having objects that don't exist. um,
Yeah.
and I
They're
mean,
real. We
yeah,
just say that they're real, but they are inexistent, or they are
yeah,
they're subsistent or insistent or whatever. They're just not, because this is a scholastic
yeah,
distinction, right?
yeah,
I mean, and probably
yeah,
otherwise,
yeah,
they're not interacting on the same plane with other existence,
yeah.
right? Um,
Well, I mean, because the two sides of the question would be, on the one hand, is there existence that intelligence does not
mhm.
penetrate or observe or
Yeah.
have, implications into? Um, and does intelligence itself go so broad as to exceed existence and exceed reality and these things? Maybe indirectly it has a substrate of existence and reality somehow,
Mhm.
but
Well, I think it's part of, yeah, I mean that's a problematic way of putting it in itself, but um I would say it's an aspect of reality, right? I would say reality for me necessarily exceeds intelligence and imagination and all of that. Even though those things are incredibly vast and open-ended,
mhm.
reality is just that and the things that are not part of that or that don't have their conditions of genesis in those processes.
But
So
so
all of what,
is it I don't want to say stuff, but is it stuff that exists that could be known and has like intelligibility to it that way? Or are you saying like there is just aspects of reality or parts or things that
yeah.
like just inherently will always be outside of what is intelligible?
Yeah. Oh, I think yes. I mean, that's a really good question. So then, yeah. And I do think that the latter is and kind of must be true. So I'm not a rationalist in that
Yeah.
sense. Like I don't think reality is intelligible in toto. And I think that's the whole point of my, basic posit of underdetermination, right?
Yeah.
Is that underdetermination is always the most generic thing and what we always encounter at the limit of determinability.
Yeah.
And some of that we just have to kind of suck it and say, like, that's just not determinable from here. It doesn't mean that it is in some ultimate sense absolutely indeterminate. It may or may not mean that. We just
Yeah.
can't say that. It's just like that is beyond the horizon of intelligibility because we are contingent beings,
Yeah.
because we happen to be in a situation, and this ends up becoming part of the problem that I have with everyone from Whitehead to Hegel, and basically like metaphysicians in general. Even though I consider myself a metaphysician,
Mm.
like I'm not against metaphysics. I'm just saying that it's a very very narrow thing. Metaphysics, like it's a very minimal thing for me, right? And it's
Mm.
basically it's almost a negative thing more than anything. It's
Mm.
about what you can't say. And
Mm.
what you can say is more about inquiry and prosaicness.
Mm.
And in prosaicness, you can say basically anything, in the sense that I had an experience and I tell you I had this experience. For you to say, oh, that wasn't real, it's like, pff, that's nonsense,
Yeah.
right? The correct response, a more appropriate response is if you want to ask a question about it. So if you want to go from the prosaic to inquiry, is to say something like, in what way was that real? What are
Mm.
its conditions of
Mm.
realization,
Mm.
right?
Well,
Um,
this is the yeah. I mean, that's phenomenology in a way, like the back and forth
yeah,
between these
yeah,
and abductive variation, right? I
yeah,
mean, that is the way in which we, uh, you're taking in apodictic or like there's evidence that doesn't have any kind of meddling through reason,
yeah.
and but like, what can you do with that? Like that on its own does not get you much. And this is actually
No,
Brentano's starting point in some way. He takes from Compton, whatever. This idea,
August.
August, yes, that you can't observe what he calls inner perception, or you could just think like awareness or immediate experience. That you
Mhm.
can't observe it, but it has in itself apodictic, or you could say just absolute evidence, right? Like
Do you experience it or feel it but not observe it? I mean, what is how does it make itself? I don't know. Known is going to be the wrong word. It doesn't make itself known because it's clearly something you can't have knowledge about. But
yeah, well, one of the ways to think about that is like anger or something like that. When you're
yeah,
feeling anger,
yeah,
your object is whatever you're fucking mad at,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but you're not observing yourself having that feeling. And like, okay, let's say you do shift to that kind of, and this is like in Stoicism and Buddhism
yeah,
in certain ways and stuff.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
changes the emotion and it disrupts it in various ways and
Yeah,
creates a
and
new
I mean
emotion.
and that's a practice. It's a
Yeah,
soteriological practice
yeah,
in those contexts. It's like,
yeah,
how do I distance myself from this emotion so that it doesn't rule me,
yeah,
destroy my
yeah,
relationships, but in anger, blah blah blah. So
yeah.
it's a very useful practice. But obviously, yes, by grasping it and observing it, you have denatured it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
there's something like dissociative or depersonalizing or whatever you want to say in the phenomenological move. I mean, he even says like,
yeah,
all right, so the best thing we can do is like remember after we feel something immediately how it was
yeah,
and do these, and then Husserl picks this up and creates phenomenology out of it. But like memory is fallible, so we have to be
yeah,
like also practicing this. And but there is something dissociative and depersonalizing, or like
yeah.
a depersonalizing in a kind of pathological sense.
Well, potentially, I was going to say
Yeah,
it's potentially pathological.
yeah.
It
If
also
you
is.
do it all the time, like if you're
Yeah,
living the phenomenon, and like this is where the idea of authenticity, like Husserl comes up with this idea of authenticity that then Heidegger picks up about, being in it, like really staying in the
yeah.
phenomenological attitude and not getting sucked back into our, not only our presumptions and things like this within science or something, but even in our daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, but if you can't feel your feelings because
Yeah,
you are immediately always distancing, of course we know there are a suite of
yeah,
pathologies, with psychopathy at one, edge of that, one limit of that. So you can't feel other people's feelings. You can't feel feelings in general, probably because you're so traumatized by excessively intense feelings at an
yeah,
early stage of development that you have sort of permanently dissociated from them.
yeah,
And I think there are all sorts of psychopathologies that result from, but a kind of practiced dissociation or even a practiced depersonalization. And that you could say it's a Buddhist thing. It's the practice of anatman, right? Anatta, right? So you are depersonalizing,
yeah,
de-selfing,
yeah,
not selfing anymore, in the active sense, is also a way to avoid pathology.
yeah,
Um, so there's a slight paradox there,
totally.
obviously.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
you know.
No, completely. And my goal is not to pathologize phenomenology and all this, but
Cool.
but there is a disruption within the like if we want to do something that isn't actually observation, because observation is kind of immediate, and then like I mean observation in the proper scientific sense is
Yeah,
taking measurements and
yeah,
using these like specific methods that we can't use in the psychological realm
yeah,
through our memory and trying to reconstruct and describe our experience. Like we just can't use, and like most attempts to do neurophenomenology and this kind of thing just collapse into the physical account and aren't really doing. They're like, how
right.
can we just like explain away this thing somebody described, and like maybe we should get better at describing them, but ultimately only to explain them away in
Yeah, and there tends to be an illusion or a delusion, and I think this is also common in some of the philosophy maybe that we began with.
yeah,
That observation is neutral, right?
yeah,
Uh, that observation doesn't change the thing that's being observed,
right,
so that you can sort of achieve a sort of perfect or clean dissociation, and therefore a view from nowhere or
right,
whatever.
yeah,
Um, Whereas, I would say a property, something that can be observed, is necessarily relational, right?
yeah,
You can observe something from here and not from over there. And in many cases, by setting up, like in science, and this is a sort of Bachelardian constructivist point about science, by setting up precise conditions for observation, you are in a way creating a world, right? I mean,
yeah,
an effective theory describes a world. It brings it's an ontogenetic thing to
yeah,
create an effective theory. Um, and you are to some degree, and not arbitrarily, right?
mhm,
Not, with no restrictions. Obviously, you're setting things up so that you can identify specific restrictions on appearing. But those things that thereby appear have not necessarily appeared otherwise, right? You have brought forth something
mm,
that doesn't have a kind of neutral observer independent existence.
yeah,
But then there's a lot of moves in sort of computationalist theory these days, in things like the free energy principle as well, etc., to generalize the notion of observation. And that is very consistent, I think, with say Whitehead and his generalization of experience or
yeah,
prehension. So that something about observation, at least, and that relational reciprocal interaction where, observer is interacting with from a specific viewpoint and potentially changing observed and being changed by observed,
yeah,
at least in a minimal sense, that, having an observation is different from not having made that
yeah,
observation. So you are changing your state.
yeah,
Um, that becomes an important posit of any kind of relational view. But just quickly also to
mhm,
bring in the discussion on possibility again.
yeah,
I think what this the difference between feeling and observing can also be thought of in terms of the difference between concrete possibility being something that we feel, right? Um, and that, when we speculatively generalize from that feeling, and that is a kind of perception of latency,
mm,
uh, a capacity to be otherwise. We speculatively generalize from the feeling.
mm,
Um, we get this notion of concrete possibility that things are essentially underdetermined and can be other than they are, right?
yeah,
But that can be the claim can stop almost there, right?
mm,
Like things can change, right? Or change is basic. And then there's abstract possibility,
mm,
which is where we are trying to describe, determinate or definite, if you want, states of possibility, right?
yeah,
Like this and not that, or these are the possible forms that could ingress. They're the lures for the next moment. I can preview them in a way and instantiate one. I can make a decision over a process of actualization,
mm,
etc. Um, and I think I'm quite interested in Bergson's critique right at that point, and also the way that John Wall, who I've been reading a little
mm,
bit of recently,
nice,
and
yeah,
want to read a lot more of. He
definitely,
just like a massively important dude for
yeah,
for like between Bergson and all the other French people
yeah,
that
definitely, yeah,
because the major conduit, like for Hegel, before Kojève, before Hippolyte, for
mhm,
Kierkegaard,
mhm,
for James and
mhm,
White,
mhm,
like he wrote this book toward Vers le concret, towards the
yeah,
concrete,
yeah, yeah,
which is like about James Whitehead and Gabriel
yeah,
Marcel, right? And I
right,
think
yeah, yeah,
like the major conduit for the reception of those guys in
yeah,
in and I mean he
yeah,
was like Levinas's mentor. I mean
yeah,
he's like everywhere. He's just this
yeah,
incredible. He adjudicated Sartre's aggregation,
right,
like
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah,
so he was the one who had to decide whether de Beauvoir or Sartre should get the top mark. Like
right,
like
yeah,
everywhere but we don't. He seems to be so little read in the
yeah,
Anglophone.
and
telephone.
translate like very little
Yeah,
translated. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
So I'm trying to press Taylor Adkins to translate Vers le Concret because it's like
amazing. Yeah,
1932.
yeah, it's
It's
crazy.
right. I don't know all the Whitehead he had read. Like I don't know if
Mm,
he had read all of Process and Reality at that point, or if he could have.
mm.
Certainly, Science in the Modern World. But anyway, he has a similar concern.
And he was
He
in all of I think the Collège de France
Yeah,
courses of Bergson. Yeah,
yeah. So Bergson was his PhD supervisor.
right.
Uh,
Was
yeah,
he?
I think yeah, he was
Because I don't
his.
think he supervised dissertations at the
Um,
Collège de France. I don't, but he did study closely with. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't think Bergson was actually signing off on.
I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that he was a supervisor, but maybe he was just an advisor, and it's been
Yeah,
conflated. Um, but Wall was teaching at the Sorbonne for like 4 decades or
yeah,
something. And so he's also like a great mentor for Deleuze, and partly got Deleuze into everyone from like Hume to Proust to obviously Whitehead to
yeah,
like so he's anyway he's a big dude, but he has this, and I'm only just dipping my toes into his work, but he does have this. He loves Whitehead, but he
yeah,
has this concern about Whitehead, which is the same concern that I have, really, which is that Whitehead, it hinges on this difference between concrete possibility and abstract possibility, which
yeah,
is, I think, what Bergson is talking about in The Possible and the Real,
yeah,
basically.
definitely.
That this abstract possibility is a retrojection,
Hmm.
is basically transcendental illusion.
Yeah,
Uh, like things are not possible in the definite sense
no, no, no.
before
Yeah, yeah,
before they happen.
yeah,
But it's not the case that meant, because everyone, when you say things like that, or when I say, to certain Whiteheadians that,
yeah,
well, I want to, critique or reformulate eternal objects, people hear some kind of assertion of bare actuality or something like
mhm.
that. And I'm like, firstly, there is no bare actuality. That isn't like in some ontic sense or whatever. That is
Yeah,
just another abstract category.
yeah,
Um, but there is also a difference between concrete possibility, which again, these are all categories, but concrete possibility and abstract possibility, which is precisely what I'm talking about. I'm saying like they're absolutely like virtuality or possibility is just the capacity of actuality to be other than it is in some sense,
yeah.
right? They aren't.
Well, so there are these because since we've talked about this last, I thought about it a little bit. Like there are uh, cases where psychologically possibilities just like don't have valence. Or I mean, there's a case of Schneider that Merleau-Ponty looks at, and this guy has like severe brain
Yeah,
uh, lesions and this kind of thing, and he just doesn't generate possibilities.
yeah,
And like he and it has all of these widespread effects on him, like his sex life is completely
yeah,
gone
yeah,
and like all of these and like he can't learn new tasks, like he's like
yeah,
makes
yeah,
wallets and he
yeah,
can do that, but he can't like
yeah,
spontaneously take up a situation. And now I don't know if that means that there's no possibility for him in general, because if possibility is part of the makeup of of reality, like your psyche isn't going to make reality stop. you know Reality has to be a pure necessity mechanism for you to get
yeah,
bare actuality as
yeah,
pure
yeah,
necessitarian whatever.
yeah,
Like possibility still has to be at play in there, but there is some kind of psychological, and I don't know if this is concrete possibility or what, but it's at least a kind of existential or phenomenological possibility, in which it does seem like, and then there are these cases, Bergson even looks at, you might have read the false recognition, where it's
mm,
basically people have like super intense deja vu, where they
yeah.
just think that everything has already happened and that everything is completely, just playing out some necessitarian already planned.
It's just
Yeah.
the limit of anamnesis, right? These
Yeah.
guys are anamnetic ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he's against this being
Of course.
like, yeah, necessitarianism.
Because
But
he's right.
what's that?
I said because he's right-minded, but I
Oh,
don't
yeah, yeah,
necessarily want to go there because I don't think I do agree with many of his theses on memory. But
yeah, fair.
yeah, continue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, basically, he thinks that this is a case where you're not living the open, like contingent part of life, and basically you're stuck in the past. So it's as
Yeah,
if you're not
yeah,
perceiving the becoming of the present and only what has just happened. And it's
yeah,
like, yeah, I mean, they feel that it's all happened before because they only have half of the conscious world at their experience level,
yeah.
for whatever reason.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, these are such great examples, and of course, there is an operative reality to abstract possibility,
Yeah,
uh, and we as human organisms or whatever, it's we require that to be fully functioning, you know, what would normally pass as a human. And I mean, this is just a thesis on the imagination as well, right? And so the reality, the operative reality of the imagination is we can conceive of things and then we can bring them into being, right?
yeah,
And if you can't do that, you're obviously going to be radically impaired.
yeah,
And the reality of the imagination, and I mean and when I say reality, I mean efficacy, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like the capacity of it to change the world is just all around us all the
yeah,
time, right? Here I sit in a house with electric light and microphones and books and shit all around me, and it's like the human. I say things like the human niche is that, or we are the organism whose niche is niche construction. All that niche construction
hmm
stuff, like this creation of this radically contingent human world,
hmm
which changes
hmm
the whole world in these
yeah,
dramatic ways, which are not always good, but is ample demonstrative proof of the reality of the imagination and the
yeah,
importance of, therefore, the capacity to conceptualize abstract possibility. And Bergson isn't denying that at all.
mm,
I mean, the first passage in that essay is like, when I imagine a dinner, blah blah blah. Even though I know all the people who come over, so he's talking about exactly that
yeah.
um, you know, process
Well, and
of
he thinks that abstractions have a certain efficacy, right? I mean, I think this is what you're getting at, but like he talks about learning to do the waltz. He says you
yeah,
need to like imagine every move that's going to happen, and then once you learn it, you stop and you get rid of that, and it doesn't
yeah,
really help. At a certain point, it's like a training wheel that needs
yeah.
to be dropped.
Much
Uh,
like improvising or whatever, right? If
yeah.
you're
I mean,
thinking,
Whitehead is more optimistic, I think, about abstraction, but Bergson is not completely, against it.
well, I'm super optimistic about abstraction in the sense
Yeah,
that I think it radically changes the world, and my whole critique of effective theory in science and everything is a critique of its limitations. It's not a critique of its ridiculous power, you
yeah,
know, like clearly, therefore, and this could go back to the irreal and stuff.
hmm
Those effective theories are themselves real things in the world. I mean, to put it in a trite, over quoted Korzybskian way, right? It's yes, map is not the territory, but it doesn't mean that maps are less real than
right,
territory.
right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's like the
yeah,
Deleuze. The map is maybe more real sometimes than the territory.
the map gets in our eyes and it determines our behavior
Yeah,
often,
yeah,
and that's part of, again, this Hegelian practice, but any kind of contemplative practice where we're trying to get rid of all those presuppositions so we can see something more clearly.
mhm,
I mean, the problem again with Hegel is kind of then going to this absolute and saying, and now I am perceiving the true structure of being and allowing it to unfold and
yeah,
blah blah blah. And as long
yeah,
as I maintain myself through this labor in
mhm,
this space of
mhm,
presuppositional thought, I can let thought itself,
yeah,
because it has an and so that's that structure you were talking
mhm,
about earlier, like that structure
mhm,
of thought. And Hegel seems to think, and I mean, I'm always going to be straw manning Hegel because he thinks everything and he's amazing and blah blah blah. But like that is the whole thing, and that is essentially that's the unity of thought and being, right? In the
mhm,
sense that structure of thought. And so the role of contingency, then, there is real contingency in Hegel, but contingency is a way we discover truths that are themselves not formed through that process, right?
mhm,
So we might as children do a lot of babbling and blah blah blah, but we're eventually going to get to the truth of the proposition, of
mhm,
the concept, of whatever it is. And that truth was always implicit, Contingency is just involved in the making explicit of something
Right.
that was implicit. And I'm obviously just way more Darwinian, and
Mhm.
I'm just like, no, contingency is generative of novel truths,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah, I mean, well, if the pre-articulate, underdetermined uh, definiteness of intellect is infinitely determinable. I mean, it kind of like gives another route through and outside of the Hegelian closure,
Mhm,
because I mean, we could say that there's some pre-existent definiteness behind the triangle, and like
mhm.
we as humans following Euclid, whatever, we have a way of realizing that. But there are other ways of realizing it, and they
And
still reflect something. And I don't even want to use the word reflect, but they still uh, are connected in some way to that definiteness, even though the expression of it is completely different than a triangle.
yeah, and the truth of the triangle, and there is a truth, but it's a truth that's contingent on a bunch of axioms.
Yeah.
And when I'm saying like there are no uncreated forms of definiteness, what I'm saying is that those forms of definiteness, that you can always ask a question about their conditions of realization. And I don't mean actualization, I mean realization. Like, so that includes them as latent intelligibles and
Mhm.
stuff, right?
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
always what was the like what does it require? And I mean, this is Whitehead's problem, right? Like Whitehead is abreast of constructivism of his time. Things will go further after Whitehead in mathematics, and obviously in science. But he is asking the question of like, what is the minimal set of operations or whatever required to bring forth forms of definiteness? And if those are the minimal set of operations, we can't get past them, and they already are correlated with all of these forms of
Yeah.
definiteness. Those forms of definiteness
I
must be
mean, it's
uncreated.
the chicken and the egg of constraints and work, basically. Like
Yeah, yeah,
constraints require work, but work can only occur with constraints. And like,
yeah.
is there an or, field of constraints? And could that exist without work? Or is there an original that doesn't have constraints? I mean, like you get into the,
Trying to determine an origin at this point.
yeah,
And if evolutionary science tells us something about this, it's that you can't do that. Like you
yeah,
can't do that at the limit. You will
yeah,
always encounter. This is why you will always encounter underdetermination on the
yeah.
horizon. Right? And so
Well,
any
and
given,
you still get the same question of natural selection, or of even of maybe even variation itself, or like the fact that variations amount to something, which is basically natural selection or whatever.
yeah,
But like that is not. I mean, that is realized in a million different ways, and oftentimes with completely different mechanisms and this kind of thing. Where
yeah.
does the constraint space predetermine existence, such that we wouldn't really have any existence if it weren't for the fact that differences that make a difference
Yeah.
create something new and different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. But I think all we can say is that there are all of these orthogonal domains in which those sorts of principles or operations principles are operative. We can't say that there's a nested stack of them such that it goes back to some set of
No,
constraints.
no, and it definitely couldn't even work that way. I mean, that's the whole question of. I mean, if every mechanism that realizes natural selection is different, then you can't expect there to be a mechanism prior to natural selection that produces it, or even whatever causal prior step that makes it. I mean, the same thing, the same problem applies with uh, abductive variation or abductive intensive variation, or even habit. Right? It's like the first person who ever habituated it's obviously not a person but like the first time there was habit in all of the shebang, as you would call it. And then somebody says, oh shit, did you just invent habit? And they're like, no, I used habit to
Yeah, yeah. Well,
adapt to the situation.
that's exactly what person.
Yeah.
Peirce tries to do that
Yeah.
and go to the universe of firstness first and then construct from that point. And someone's like, yeah, but you always had it was basically implicit. You're a
Yeah.
Hegelian after all, which
Yeah.
Peirce, later in his life kind of, I think, realized more and more that how Hegelian he was. But,
Once
that,
William James started giving him nitrous oxide.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know if that timeline works.
But yeah, you always sort of presuppose the capacity for habit formation. So in a sense, you can take this triad, like the evolutionary triad,
Yeah.
variation, selection, inheritance, and technically you don't have a habit until you have inheritance.
Yeah.
But in a way, all you can say there's a kind of ordinality. You can kind of say, well, there's variation, not there are variations. That was almost the wrong way of saying it because
Yeah. Yeah.
that's already determinable or definite, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's like
Right.
there is concrete possibility, which is
Yeah.
under determination, which is creativity for Whitehead, I
Mm,
take it, right? Then there are constraints
mm,
that operate in some sense on what that variational process. And in fact, those constraints are how you get the first variants or variables,
mm,
because there are no variables without constraints, right?
yeah.
There's just variation or just underdetermination. There's
Mm,
just concrete possibility, which is just it, not it. There's no it. It's
yeah.
just change.
Yeah.
It's some abstract and this is all very abstract, right? It's Dure, I guess, as this abstract thing. And then because some variants are more persistent than others, you have habit or inheritance, right? And so that's why Peirce will say something like, you know, that natural selection, when you take the whole thing, is essentially it's not a logical tautology, but it's basically a tautology. That which is good at persisting tends to persist. And I don't think he's saying that's a bad thing. He's saying this is exactly the kind of principle you would want if you were going to start reasoning about why in a universe in which he says variation is the most obtrusive character of reality,
Yeah.
why we nonetheless see clumps of variation, why we
Mm,
actually
mm,
do see, determinate or definite forms. And of course, he's cribbing from a lot of different people, including Hegel, but certainly Darwin in a big way at that point, right? Because that is Darwin's precise question. Darwin's like, all these beetles, they're varying in every bloody character state, but nonetheless, it
yeah.
appears even though any given systematist, any given taxonomist would group these, would separate this, big population of beetles into two species. Um, and none, even though they would differ a little, there would be a bit of arbitrariness in that for some, for one of them, some of them would be in A, and for some of those ones that are in A, for this person, it would be in B, blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, they would both agree that there are two species here.
Mm,
So there's something non-arbitrary
mm,
about the fact that there are these two, species,
mm,
or mnemic themes, if you want, that have been
yeah.
varied. Um, but it seems like the variation is always exceeding that. So variation seems to come first
Mm,
in this sense, right? And then these two groupings are like stabilizer. Of course, he's reasoning statistically and all that. It's the early days of statistics, really. But they are like statistical, forms of stability, basically, in a
yeah.
broader.
But do
Um,
you have this? So this is where I think the Bergson versus Whitehead and all of this
yeah,
comes in, and like even modern science with
yeah,
laws and things. It's like certain variations
yeah,
uh, are possible, or are at least not impossible until they happen, and then they become possible if we want to
yeah,
be
yeah,
true to Bergson.
yeah.
But there are at least retroactively certain variations that seem impossible that we could imagine. Like, oh, why didn't this just happen? And it's like, well, the physical laws say that it couldn't have happened, so it didn't. Or you would say it could have happened, and there was some Klineman like infinitesimal
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
swerve in necessity, and or whatever. Maybe there was a quasi conscious kind of Rie and Whiteheadian decision going on at a sub organic level, and like whatever, like certain variations happened, and then you could even go down these the whole habit thing where
Yeah.
certain possibilities become more possible once they've happened, even morphic resonance beyond the individual or in the individual through habit. But like, okay, so ultimately we're still, I think that like I follow Peirce in this whole move and your like way of putting it together. I love it. And but I still feel like you reach a certain point and you're like, well, isn't there this mysterious thing that we kind of just said, okay, like certain variations, happened, and it seems that there were other possible variations, and these ones happened and other ones didn't. Like,
Yeah,
how can we? And Whitehead has his eternal objects, at
yeah,
least
yeah,
partially. We
yeah,
also have the creativity of every actual occasion, so it's going to be a mix of the
yeah,
two of those.
yeah,
Why did these? Well, there are only certain horizons of variation in any given concrete situation. There's not one set, or else he would be a necessitarian.
yeah.
And there's this creative choice going into it on multiple levels, and yeah,
There are degrees of freedom. I mean, we just
yeah,
put this into sort of straightforward effective theoretic or physical theoretic terms just for the moment. There are degrees of freedom, so there are like decisions to be made in a sense, right? But the situation we don't want to be in my opinion, is in the effective theory situation where we have decided what the if there could still be degrees of freedom, right? And this could still be the difference between definiteness and determinacy within an effective theory. There's a massive state space,
yeah,
which is the possibility, and only some subset of that is going to be realized. So
yeah.
that's where the decision comes in. But we don't want to be in a situation where we are claiming that the set of degrees of freedom is definable for all time or
No, no, no,
indeterminate.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
you can always make a different decision. Like a theoretician makes a decision about a specific domain and what degrees of freedom are relevant
Hmm.
to a question that they have to ask about that particular kind of domain.
Hmm.
And we see, I mean, cosmology is obviously always going to be a big stress tester of, at least when we're talking about physical law. We're winding it back, and we're going like, there all these things have happened, but at some point, it seems there are these fundamental constraints which have constrained all of that possibility for the past, 13.9 billion years or whatever. But there are a lot of problems in cosmology, as we know. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and increasingly cosmologists have recourse to more evolutionary type models where they are asking, I mean, to massively simplify questions of like, why these laws? Or, the notion of the past hypothesis, which the philosopher of physics David Albert describes it as, which is, like, given initial conditions and given entailing laws, this mode of reasoning, which is basically effective theoretic, plays out. But we had to take as given the initial conditions and the entailing laws for this to be operative and to be
But
workable. We're
so
not.
even with that, so okay, we have certain conditions for earthly life, right? And of course, that can go through a latitude of shifts, but it really can't get outside of that. And okay, so from the living perspective that we have within that constraint field, um, you know, uh, there are certain invariant aspects
Yeah,
of
yeah,
everything that we experience, and
yeah.
as long as we're alive, we have to breathe or whatever. Like, it can be very simple. It doesn't have to be um,
Mhm.
so complicated. So um, I mean, I think that Whitehead could say something like, there's an epoch in which existence is so different that that's like irrelevant, but that
Mhm.
wouldn't make it not an eternal object. It's like, as long as this qualitative definiteness is relationally set with respect to these other constraint systems, and like, is there an epoch where work doesn't require constraints, or where constraints don't require work, or like those kinds of questions, like, or is that like always the case, and maybe there's epochs or there's universes or whatever the fuck you want to call it that are like completely different than ours, but like, and it's like almost unimaginable, but like you still need constraints to do work in that unimaginable world or something like that.
maybe. I mean, one possibility is that this, like, what kind of question are we asking, and at what point does this kind of question become meaningless in some sense, right? But another thing we might say is if we're saying something like variation, selection, and inheritance, if we're going for a very minimal, generalizable operative schema of that nature, um, all we would then be saying is that yeah, you could think about it in terms of work and constraints, or you could think about it in terms of like energy in a fairly vague sense, and constraint equals work, right? Equals the possibility of work. Um, yeah, but what we would be saying is that the nature of the constraints is radically underdetermined, right? So, I,
But you still have like the necessary relational structure
yeah, yeah. Well,
of
so you,
work and constraints. And like I'm fine with like, the theoretical possibility that there's a type of existence that goes outside of that. But like
Mhm.
even if we grant that, have we escaped the eternal objects? Or have we just said that,
Well,
eternal objects really only have concrete ingressive
mhm.
domains? And there are other eternal objects which govern these other domains that don't require constraints and work and stuff like that.
So here's a way. Let's zero in on what eternal objects are for you. But here's what I will initially say. Um, I just totally lost my train of thought.
Shit.
Um, basically, okay. So I would say that Whitehead has this scheme
Yeah.
where he makes creativity in a way more general
Mm.
and more primordial in some sense. But I would just want to say general actually, because I don't want to make this a implicitly or tacitly temporal or
Right.
linear or nested
Yeah.
structure as such.
Right.
But in a sense, like creativity is in a sense, but in an undefinable sense. And he's very clear that it's undefinable because what does he say about the origin of the PNG? But that's the PNG EO relationship, really.
PNG
Uh,
being the primordial
Primordial.
nature of God and the
Yeah,
eternal
not
objects.
yeah, not Papua New Guinea, where I've done a bunch of work on snakebite, but yeah, right. What is the origin? Okay, the origin of that is absolutely irrational to Whitehead, right?
Yeah.
So he's very clear about that. I think that's actually a problem, but we can come
Mm,
back to that. That's not where I
mm,
want to be right
mm,
now. I want to say that okay, that's absolutely irrational. So you have an order of things, and when you get to the existence of the PNG EO relationship, I want to say you've still got a couple of stages, perhaps, that you can go through where you are saying now that there are these generic operations
mm,
that characterize any domain. So
mm.
initially there's creativity, there's no domain, right?
Yeah,
It's not a domain specific thing, it's the most general thing, right? It goes between all the domains, so to speak, right?
definitely.
But when you step into a domain, um, the very fact of the definition or defining of a domain
Yeah.
is associated with certain key operations,
Mhm.
such as actual occasions, eternal objects, right? For example, right, and other elements of the categorical scheme, perhaps. And again, not a Whitehead scholar, but just saying this is one way of thinking about
Yeah, yeah.
what I think he's doing. Then from a position within a particular domain, you could start to say something more specific or definite about eternal objects. So
Mhm.
you could say something about like ratios or colors or
Mhm.
something like that. But that's already three steps in, right? You've already said creativity is more general than eternal objects and
Mhm.
the PNG. When we get to the point of the relationship between the PNG and the
Mhm.
EOs, all we're talking about is generic operators that characterize domains. So
Mhm.
there is going to be something like eternal object that, that operation will exist, actual occasions will exist or whatever. These are devised categories, which by
Mhm.
the way, I love your,
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, we should talk about that.
Yeah.
But there are those generic operations. And then in any given domain, we can now speak of examples. Like we're in a given domain, these are the eternal objects.
Mhm.
These are actual occasions. That's just how an effective theory works,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So eternal objects are all the possibilities.
Mhm.
and actual occasions are the actualized
Hmm.
reality, which
Hmm.
is in relation to those possibilities and can go this way or that way, but not that way because it already ingressed some
Hmm.
path back there that cut
Hmm.
off these possibilities or blah blah blah. And
Yeah.
I am not saying, because I always get heard as saying, by our dear friend Matt, that I'm not saying that this is a state space in exactly the same way
Hmm.
that it is different physical theories. In fact, there are lots of different kinds of phase and state spaces
Hmm.
in physical theories. These are
Hmm.
not all
Yeah.
reducible one to the other. And Whitehead is definitely doing something different. And that's partly indexed just by the fact that his EOs are qualitative as well, right? So he is rejecting the idea of secondary properties or whatever. And he's saying that we
Yeah.
can reason in the same way about emotions and colors and whatever as we can about magnitude
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
other forms of definiteness, whatever. And he's not imposing a specific metric. He's doing all these things, right? Which is great. But he is nonetheless walking us into a situation through multiple steps
Yeah.
where we are ultimately defining a domain in a
Hmm.
way that is isomorphic at a sufficient level of abstraction with the physical and mathematical theories that he has done work on.
Yeah.
uh, and is trying to generalize into metaphysics. And so, just as Matt has said, and I think it's the right thing to say, he's talking about the conditions of the possibility of effective theorization. But what
Hmm.
that ends up looking like once you've done this walk into a domain is that at some level he has defined the most general possible effective theory. Like
Hmm.
he's preserved the structure of it in a way,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
definite but indeterminate possibilities, which are
Yeah.
the EO,
Hmm.
the determinate actuality, which is the actual occasions, and the relationship between them. And that is a pretty generic, and there's nothing wrong with it being generic. It's good. Like what he does is
Well, he's
incredible.
setting out to make a generic. So,
Exactly. And he's setting
yeah.
out to show us that, these different forms of reasoning, different modes of reasoning, like theology and science, are not, in fact, as distinct as people imagine them to be. So they
Yeah.
are compatible. And I mean, many people have made
Well,
that argument in different ways.
yeah.
And it's absolutely appropriate because those scientific forms of reasoning are simply derived from theological and, Greek and blah, blah, blah modes of
Well, this,
reasoning.
I mean, this again gives us a nice contrast with Bergson, I think,
Yeah.
because, I mean, Whitehead is very clearly trying to do, and like I use this term, device categories,
Yeah.
set up, make some distinctions that have an operative value, and
Yep.
then explain how everything like can still uh, relate and how it uncovers everyday ordinary phenomena as being implicated in this schema and things like that, right? That's the kind of speculative philosophy approach that Whitehead's doing, and that I'm trying to do a little bit in this piece. Bergson, on the other hand, is like entirely on the side of method, I guess you could say, and doesn't want to create these, and like creates certain, like I would say he does have certain device categories in this sense. I mean, in Time and Free Will, he has quantitative multiplicity and qualitative multiplicity, or you know, clock time versus Dure, and he does make these distinctions. But even like the distinction between actual and virtual
Mhm.
is not very clean. It's not a
Yeah.
clean cut, and he goes between a more Deleuzian at times. I would say when he talks about virtual memory and matter memory and things like this, and like the virtuality of movement within perception. It's this very like dynamic, phenomenological. It's like the background. It's not
Mhm.
something that you can thematize and have a concept of and have a representation of, but it's working, behind the scenes, but almost on the scene kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not an unconscious. It's like nearly unconscious or something like that. Um, Versus he uses virtuality at times to just mean eidetic abstract
Yeah.
projection, like representational. It almost
Yeah.
just means representation at certain times, um,
Yeah. But does
which
he
is
have
the
an
opposite of
yeah,
virtual
yeah,
memory, because
yeah,
virtual
yeah, yeah.
memory can't be a representation. So
So
anyway, yeah,
virtuality is just latency, and there are different
yeah,
forms of latency,
yes,
right? That
exactly, yeah,
you just described just goes
yeah,
back to mapping onto the distinction between concrete and abstract possibility.
yeah, yeah,
They're both real to me,
yeah,
but they're not essentially coordinate, right?
yeah,
saying that abstract possibility is in fact in an important sense derived from concrete possibility.
Mhm.
Um, and
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why you can't say these specific
Mhm.
abstract possibles, like a ratio or a color or whatever, are uncreated. They're not. They have a
Yeah.
specific
Yeah.
constructive, right?
But
Yeah, sorry.
created too is a hard thing because I mean it's going to get us right back to where we started with existence,
Yeah,
reality, and all these things. Like I certainly don't think that like the PNG sits there and says, "All right, you know what? All work will require constraints." And then they're like, the angels are like, "Shit, that's a really good idea. That's going to get a lot." But I don't think that you can possibly imagine any type of existence that we know anything about
yeah,
that doesn't apply in, right? And this you could say the same thing about like irreversibility, right? And I don't want to chalk these up to laws of the universe or constants like cosmological constants, like oh, there's just this forgotten cosmological concept or constant called the irreversibility of time. Like
yeah,
maybe people are trying to
yeah,
explain
yeah,
things that way,
yeah,
but
yeah,
and I don't even think like I think we've talked about this like irreversibility. There's not really a concept of irreversibility. I mean, sure, we can get very logicy and say you have two times A and B, and like B
yeah, yeah,
always comes after A,
yeah,
like no fucking way it comes
yeah,
before. Okay, well, now we've defined irreversibility. It's like no,
yeah, yeah,
irreversibility was the precondition to that thought in the first place and is
yeah.
what actually carried the thought through. And the thought never thought the precondition that was making it possible in
Yeah,
that process.
I would just say that that's the kind of something like the prosaic ultimacy of irreversibility. Although that could probably be questioned as a result of certain kinds of imaginative exercises. And so I would want to avoid putting limits on the imagination, even though I would say that it's a subset of reality. And I would also
And
say,
irreality.
well, I think
No. Being fun.
irreality is a special kind of reality, right? It's
Yes, of
reality
course. Yeah,
with
yeah,
with the qualifier ear.
yeah.
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 Uh, so
And
so
probably a special domain of the imagination, which is the only reason I brought
yeah,
it up.
yeah,
And
yeah. And I would also say that metaphysics is imaginative. Like so,
yeah,
what I call speculation, or
yeah,
the speculative stance we take towards
yeah.
reality is an exercise. It's a particular kind of
Which
way
is
of using
again the
imagination.
introduction to metaphysics, like the whole point there. Yeah.
So and that term, which I know Matt also really likes, imaginative generalization and all of that. And I think that's exactly right. It's just again, there are a lot of devils in the details there, and I think there is a difference between metaphysics and fiction, but both involve what I call speculative fictions, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I also think effective theories are speculative fictions. So I mean, I can get very unorthodox with all of this stuff, and I think we should talk about storytelling
Mm,
in
mm,
a minute. But
yeah.
so I don't want to put hard limits on the imagination and say like, oh, we can't imagine a reality like that. I mean, I don't. That doesn't really. I agree to some extent that that's probably true, but that just tells me something about us. And that could be, that can be as ultimate and as real as anything without being metaphysical. Because even when we do inquiry, we are actually. So here's a funny thing. Like I'm going to contradict myself right now, which is I said I wouldn't want to put limits on the imagination, but I also am always to be heard saying things like nature is complex beyond our wildest imagination or something like
Mm,
that. Like
mm,
go out and look at the world like closely, and
yeah.
you will very rapidly find things you could never possibly have imagined. Now, I'm like a great lover of imagination and a great lover of actual like speculative fiction and fantasy and all that. And I think we could talk about storytelling and world building
Yeah, yeah.
and all of that in this context very importantly. Matt and I were supposed to do a dialogue last week on this subject, but he's, as we know, a bit of a vagrant at the moment, and he's hard to get his schedule together.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I'm a great lover of that kind of thing, but at the same time, I'm a great lover of what could just be called the empirical world,
Mm,
without wanting to be too loaded about that. We can talk about the difference between different kinds of empiricism and transcendental empiricism and blah blah blah. And again, that's a John Wall
mm.
um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
influence
Yeah,
on
yeah, yeah.
Wall is saying that Schelling is the transcendental
Okay.
empiricist. And anyway, blah blah blah. And that would be
Yeah, because Bergson uses the term superior empiricism,
yeah,
but he
okay.
doesn't use this transcendental.
Yeah, well, that's also, I mean, Wall also uses that term and obviously gets it
And he
from
tries to, turn the transcendental, which would still be properly like an essence domain.
yeah,
Bergson tries to change this into just mnemic themes, this kind of
yeah, yeah. Well, I like that. Yeah.
sempiternal structuring that could be otherwise. And like, yeah,
Yeah, I think I'm obviously very sympathetic to that. And so yeah, Wall will talk about Bergson, James, but then Schelling behind all of that as this superior and even Hume he will say and Kant at their best moments, like
yeah,
not
right, yeah,
completely,
yeah,
but at their
yeah,
best
yeah.
moments are doing a kind of transcendental or superior empiricism, which will become transcendental empiricism. And I take that also just to mean the involvement, the necessary involvement of imagination in the
Yeah.
empirical. But
Hmm.
but anyway, you can go out into the world, and this is something that philosophers just don't do very much of. And it's the truth. Whether it's Heidegger talking about organisms being poor in world and all of that, and it's like, dude, you never even fucking looked at an organism. Don't tell me you know anything. You know, even even your very empirical philosophers, like I mean, from like Schelling, Schelling is not Humboldt. Schelling is influenced by Humboldt, but he is not really.
Yeah.
He's reading a lot of science. You know, um, but I don't want to hack on people, but Peirce and Whitehead. Peirce is like a real practicing empiricist,
Mhm.
but he's not really a biologist in that sense, or,
Yeah.
or a naturalist in that sense.
Yeah.
He's out like surveying and making measurements and taking samples of the seabed to work. Like he's doing like real empirical
Was
science.
he in geology? Like,
It's
what
sort
was
of
it?
he's like in the I don't know if Coast Guard is the right term, but he's
Oh, okay.
basically a kind of geological survey wing of a maritime
Oh,
organization.
okay. All right. Interesting. Yeah.
So like he's doing real empirical science, but I mean, not only all of that, we just do. I mean, I'm going to sound like a naive scientific realist when I say this, but we just do know a shitload more, even than certainly than Schelling could have known, and then Peirce could have known, and then Whitehead could have known. And what Whitehead is very poetic in his sensibilities, and that's part of his sort of radical empiricist leanings. But I don't sense that he knew much at all about biology. I know he was influenced and inspired by biology and certain biological principles, and he was talking to biologists, and they were kind of like, "You should think more ecologically." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I should." Hey,
But also I feel like that like 100 years ago, the science itself was more tactile, was more like
yeah,
nowadays it's so theoretical and it's just computer generated or
yeah.
it's just like
Well, I think that's a view. I hear what you're saying, but I think that's partly a view from the kind of science you interact with as a philosopher,
yeah,
because
sure. And biology is a bit less of
and
that, but
none of none of the like special sciences like biology is ridiculously heterogeneous, right?
oh
And
yeah,
so philosophers these days often they're like, oh, biologists think this, blah blah blah, and they often like say some neo-Darwinian thing or whatever, right? And it's like that's not how most biologists think.
yeah,
In fact, a lot of biologists aren't thinking theoretically at all. They're very involved, and that can be a
yeah.
problem.
Hmm.
They're very involved in very specific questions of mechanism or whatever, but they might be involved in any number of different kinds of laboratory-based investigation, or they might be out in the field and they might
Yeah,
be like observing organisms doing
right.
shit.
Yeah, yeah,
And some people are very transdisciplinary within biology and are doing a bunch of all of these different things, like a lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
chemical ecologists or so-called molecular ecologists who are trying to connect molecular description, like molecular biology and molecular evolution, with ecology, like trying to bring these two things together. And there is a lot
yeah,
of that kind of work being done these days. And of course, all of it is constrained by certain theoretical assumptions, and there's plenty to critique and all of that. But when I was talking about going out into the empirical world and finding something that just, radically exceeds your imagination, I'm really just talking about paying attention and
yeah,
looking. I'm talking about what I call like sacred naturalism or some shit like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But it helps to be heavily informed by scientific knowledge in the
yeah,
sense that that transforms your capacity to perceive. But Yeah, nature is incredible. Like we can just do numbers and we can talk about like how many proteoforms are there in nature? You know, there
Mm.
are vastly orders of magnitude more unique protein species than there are words in all languages in the history of humanity, right?
Yeah.
So like nature in this trivial small n sense, meaning basically like, well, I mean basically meaning physis actually, but
Mm.
yeah, is vastly more generative
Mm.
than humans, even if we are one of the most generative little islands within
Yeah.
nature, right?
Well,
And
I
so
mean, the thing with nature is it has its mix of both, right? It's like it has these incredible areas. It's like all these proteins, or
yeah,
the super ancient bacteria diversity of the planet, and like these kinds of things. But then you also have like an absurd amount of, I don't want to use the term redundancy because it's such a particular perspectivized way of looking at it, but like these repetitions of forms that are just so, I mean, even the tube to go to the rie, like there's just like endless tubes and every type of
yeah,
like of
yeah,
creation you could possibly imagine. Or I was just like at the beach and I was driving back, and sometimes the clouds get the exact pattern of the sand, the
yeah, yeah,
ripples in the sand, and it looks like exactly like
yeah,
the,
yeah, yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like, man, nature just was a little too lazy to figure out a new pattern.
So
No,
this,
and
so there are,
obviously the constraints are like like you can always point to a reason, but like, but there
yeah,
are these things that I mean, the pointing to the reason doesn't necessarily answer the larger question, which is
yeah,
like, how come half of nature, and I did half, whatever, I'm just saying this part is incredibly redundant, and you
yeah,
find the same patterns like popping up everywhere in different
yeah,
orders of magnitude, different substrates, whatever. And then on the other side, in this very narrow band, and there's a million of these different narrow bands, there's
yeah, yeah,
just almost like unlimited proliferation
yeah.
of these differences, and differences that do end up making a difference. They're not just kind of like, yeah.
Well, they're epiphenomena in the literal sense, but then they transform the
Mm,
phenomenon, right?
okay.
Like epiphenomena doesn't mean neutral unless you have like some sort of dualistic or blind
Yeah, yeah,
alley.
yeah.
And evolution is all about, like Darwinian evolution is all about converting epiphenomena into more stable and but I think there are lots of ways to respond to what you're talking about, like the conservative element in nature and the proliferative or variational or whatever. But redundancy just
I mean, I don't
happens.
even know if it's conservative, but it's at least like repetitive at
Yeah,
the
yeah,
least.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a whole cosmological story we could give. We don't need to do that. But I would just say that redundancy and degeneracy are specific things that I've worked on in molecular evolution. And they're basically, we understand we have a developing understanding, but it's going back many decades. And indeed, Darwin himself speculates in this way that redundancy and degeneracy. So the fact that either you can get two of the same thing in an organism, or sometimes many of the same thing, or you can have two different things that can perform the same
Hmm.
function. So that's respectively, that's redundancy and degeneracy. But
Okay. Yeah.
either way, you've got
But so
multiple
is
elements.
hair
Well,
degeneracy?
I mean, two elements that perform the same function, not a
Oh, wait, so
single.
degeneracy is two elements that do the same function?
Yeah,
I thought
degeneracy is
that was redundancy. So sorry,
Yeah,
my,
well, redundancy is when you have two of the same thing.
okay,
Uh,
all right. So hair is redundant.
redundant. Well, that's it's funny that you went there. Hair has an aggregate
Okay.
function that is achieved by repetition. That's not necessarily redundant. Like if hair,
Okay.
I mean,
I just meant that each follicle is kind of the same and does the same
yeah, yeah.
thing. And
I know,
like,
no. Yeah, so sometimes you get a lot of the same thing because you need a lot of it to fulfill one function. Sometimes you have two things that are the same, but you
mhm.
actually only need one of them to fulfill the
Okay.
function.
Yeah, yeah.
That's redundancy. Um,
Okay. So
degen de
it's not like my hair could block the sun, or I could use my hand. Like I could
no,
find
well,
another means to the
yeah,
same.
that's degeneracy.
That is
That's
degeneracy. Okay.
Yeah,
All right. All right.
that's two different pathways or two different traits can contribute to the same
And
function.
why is
So
it called degeneracy? Like that's not intuitive to me at all.
Well, yeah, well, I think it's partly related to the notion of degenerate ground states in physics. So with something like a Hopfield network or a spin glass, what you can see is that there are multiple different sort of energetic minima, right? And if you perturb the system, it unprestatably settles into one or the other, but you can't say where it's going to end up because they are degenerate, right? So it's got multiple ways of achieving the same
Okay.
goal, right?
Like the
And
same kind of equilibrium almost.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Right. Obviously, the biological example doesn't map neatly and formally onto that, but I think that's where at least the etymological or definitional similarity of degeneracy comes from. It's
Okay.
like
Yeah.
multiple ways, um, and it can lead to, and Terence Deacon has written very nicely about this, actually, speaking of someone you reference in your piece, it can lead to um, it can lead to vestigiality, so it can lead to the degeneration of one of those elements, but it can also lead to them becoming something else and novel, right? So specifically redundancy and degeneracy, but like molecular redundancy, where you got one gene copy. This is just an abstract example, right? But say you've got one gene copy and it encodes a product that does something important in the life of the organism. Say it then duplicates. Now you've got two copies that can both do the same thing. What can happen is that the selection is basically reduced on each individual copy. So one of them could just be deleted.
Mm.
Uh, what normally will happen is a compensation on gene expression, so you don't get too much of the product. So one of them will be downgraded but that means this other one that's been downgraded in expression, it could just get deleted, but it's basically free to vary arbitrarily. And that's one of the ways that you get more new shit.
Mhm.
So, basically, because of redundancy, you have a reduction in the constraint of selection on
Yeah. Yeah.
any element in the redundant network, and
Yeah.
therefore you get more. You unleash the basic concrete possibility, the basic underdetermination, the basic variation or overproduction of variation in the Darwinian sense.
Mhm.
See, Terence calls this inverse Darwinism because he's like, Darwinism is subtractive because it's selection over variations, whereas this is a process through which more variations are released. But I've spoken to him about this and it's publicly available, so I'm not speaking out of turn to say this. It's only inverse Darwinism relative to some really denuded, kind of weird, abstract, neo-Darwinian reading of Darwinism. For Darwin, overproduction of variation is primary. So he's already saying that exactly this
Right.
kind of in principle can happen. And he does literally talk about redundancy. He talks about degeneracy, technically speaking, because he talks about two organs that fulfill the same function, meaning that one is free to acquire other functions.
But they're
Um,
different organs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Or
yeah, I
no.
think that,
Well, it's like
anyway,
I can grab this with my left hand and my right hand. They're the like same type of organ, but like I could pick it up with my feet. That would be like a
yeah.
different.
But you could
You're
say,
talking about like it's the same organ, and then like now because only one of them is used at a
yeah,
time,
yeah,
the
yeah,
other one
yeah.
is freed up to.
But I think you could use handedness as an interesting example. So you could imagine, again, these are all abstract examples, but because of course there might be genetic biasing and all of that. Constraints get built into systems over a long period of time. That's how inheritance and habit memory and all that works, right? But you could imagine a situation where
Well, when you say constraint, not to get too like meta about this, but when you say constraints get built into systems, the
specific
systems are already. What'd you say?
specific constraints, let's say different.
Specific constraints, sure,
Yeah,
but like they're getting worked into other constraints.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Constraints are differentiated.
Yeah.
Um, like everything else in nature, right? Again, big generalization, but I was just to say, like you could have a situation where the hands are absolutely functionally, isomorphic, right? They can do everything exactly the same, but just because arbitrarily you use one more than the other for a certain thing, they end up differentiating in function.
Yeah.
And now you do have two hands, and because you wipe your ass with one hand and eat with the other hand, or whatever,
Yeah.
or you can play guitar and one hand is a picking hand and now
Yeah.
you can, like, they could have started equal,
Yeah.
but so it could be, and for some people it turns out to be arbitrary whether you play guitar left-handed or right-handed,
Yeah.
because at some point of early development there is an equal opportunity to go one way or the other, but after a while, because you
Right.
just happen to start doing it
Yeah.
one way or the other,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
become functionally differentiated, and now you can't fret very well with your right
Right.
hand, or you right, or whatever. So all the only reason I
which is
brought all
the real possibility kind of schema for Whitehead. Like the possibility space is getting narrower, which also makes those possibilities more concrete. Or I
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
if that fits into your schema of concrete and abstract, but
Um, in a way, where you throw me is because I do have a problem with the PNG CNG consequent
okay,
nature, where the
yeah.
way that's described as well.
Mhm.
Um, we can come to that. Yeah,
Well, this would be like okay, you have the PNG making a certain definiteness that gives us enough constraints to get the universe
yeah,
started.
yeah, yeah,
Now we have real decisions going on,
yeah,
and
and only
like
some
and the
taken.
actual occasions change that horizon of relevance. And
Yeah,
so I mean the in order for the EOs to have determinacy, they have to have relevance. So this is where he brings in the PNG. But that
yeah.
relevance isn't the eternal objects and isn't even, it's seemingly eternal, although I would assume the primordial nature of God is somehow eternal for Whitehead. I don't know if he ever says that
No,
specifically.
it's the first creature of creativity. I mean, yeah, and its origin. I'm pretty sure he says origin is absolutely irrational. I think it's eternal, but this is this sempiternal, eternal thing in a way, right? There's an ambiguity there, and
Yeah.
he will say uncreated, of course, but he can't say uncreated, can he? About if the PNG is the first creature of creativity, it can't be uncreated
It's
because
self creating, right? I mean,
creature. Well, it's no, I don't think you can say that. Um, because that's something that people say all the time. Let's not get onto autopoiesis right now. We could, but this whole self thing, that's actually a formal, like that's a very precise claim you're making, even if you don't intend for it to be. And again, I don't think he's Hegel. It's not all the unfolding of the concept and self revealing itself to itself so that it can come to understand itself and properly recognize itself and shit. I
yeah.
think he says it's absolutely irrational. So I think you can't qualify it by saying it's self-created. Like creativity doesn't have a self. Creativity is pure alterity in some sense, right? Like it's
Hmm.
and he doesn't. I want to get back to the redundancy thing just to finish that
Yeah,
point,
yeah,
but,
yeah.
I think um, where Whitehead leaps, he leaps, and you do need to make leaps. I'm not saying, you don't make leaps, but Whitehead makes the classic mathematician or logician's leap, where Simondon and Darwin make a different kind of leap,
Yeah, like a
uh,
biological.
more biological, more material in a sense, and not because they're not au fait with logic and mathematics, but because they are, their emphasis and their predilection, their propensity is different.
Yeah.
Um, Whitehead makes a leap from creativity to the absolutely irrational. That's the very nature of a. Matt doesn't like me to say this because there's also a prosaic element to the PNG, which is that it's the first fact of experience and stuff. We can bracket that for a second. The formal diagrammatic element of the thought, and no one could say that Whitehead doesn't have that, is a postulate,
Hmm.
right? So he goes from creativity to the absolutely irrational, which is just like I postulate this for no just so I can begin reasoning. It's prior to
Yeah.
reason. It's
But
prior to reason, which
yeah.
means in order to reason, I will have to make this postulate. The redundancy thing. Let me
But
finish
see,
the
but oh, yeah. Okay,
just
yeah,
so I
yeah.
shut up about that because I'll forget.
Yeah, yeah.
All I wanted to say was that there is a specific and important and again abstract diagrammatic. We don't have to get into all the cosmological details and blah 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 to understand this relationship between redundancy and variation in the sense that the fact that there are all these redundant elements in nature and the fact that there's this incredible proliferation of variation are not unrelated. They are like mutually implicating.
Mm.
And you can see that very easily in molecular evolution, for example. Yeah. But yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I mean that's good. I mean, I do want to say more about that, but before we before I come back to that, I want to say about primordial nature of God and all of this that
Yeah.
no, because it's just really striking. I mean, one of the things that I defend Aristotle like endlessly, but there are some things where I'm like, ah, fuck, I just literally think he's wrong here, and there's nothing I can do to like. But like the whole thing about act, like this is maybe where I like want Rie to be doing something better.
Yeah.
But if you're taking
Don't we
like,
all? Don't we all,
yeah,
Jack?
exactly, creativity, action, these kinds of concepts,
Yeah.
we know them in a certain way, and
Yeah.
maybe not even one way. Like we have
Yeah.
embodied gestural meaning making acts, we have linguistic acts, we
Yeah.
have thoughts that go beyond images and beyond this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, but like acts always and creativity is always uh, a matter of degree. It's embedded. It's thrown into a certain situation. It's all about a little bit of magic spice that kind of just reintegrates things in a way that we couldn't see before, and this whole thing. Um, but like the ultimate ground for both Aristotle and Whitehead
Yeah.
seems to be a type of creativity that doesn't do that, and that is
Act,
like
actus purus, right? Actus purus kind of
it's
thing.
like what is that? It's like it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense because like that's not what like we only know what an act is
Yeah.
in the concrete embedded.
But this is metaphysics. This is and I have a lot of problems with the way Aristotle makes this move, but and Whitehead. But this is metaphysics, though, isn't it, Jack? It's the speculative generalization.
But
Um,
the thing you're
of,
speculating and
yeah,
generalizing to is
yeah,
unlike.
yeah.
It's like
Well,
it's like all right, here's our model, which is
yeah,
based on the phenomenology of intelligent acts and
yeah,
this kind of
yeah,
thing, like a quasi hylomorphic, but
yeah,
not in the manufacturing or materialist sense, like
yeah,
a psychological
yeah, yeah,
hylomorphism.
yeah,
And then we go to a being that doesn't actually have that possibility, like it's pure act no matter,
yeah, yeah,
and like pure abstraction no concreteness, or like within creativity no embeddedness in repetition of the past. Like
yeah,
if this is the first thing to ever exist, and it's,
yeah,
I don't know, if it's not able to create itself,
yeah,
then it's just popping into exist or like whatever. Like this form of creativity is the only time creativity only ever works like that, and every
yeah,
other case is not. And actually, I don't even know what I'm talking about because the
yeah.
thing that I'm calling activity isn't activity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and you should be at the point where you don't know what you're talking about, and then you go, I reached the limit of abstraction, like, and then thereafter, I will just say under determination, and I will move back in the other direction to the empirical, and I'll start oscillating again, and I'll oscillate between abstraction and like concreteness and blah blah blah. But when
Yeah,
I hit the limit of which will just be under determination, and
yeah,
I won't actually call it creativity because
right.
I wouldn't,
Yeah,
as you know, and I won't call it the actus purus.
mm.
But I will I also won't say that it's something like pure mind and not matter or some shit like that, because then I would be taking derived categories
Yeah,
like mind and matter and projecting them. And I'm not saying we can completely do without that. I'm saying we want to minimize that.
yeah,
And so that's why I say about like pre-individuality or underdetermination that it's not mind and it's not matter. It's prior to. I mean, sorry, I should
yeah,
say that's what Simondon says it. Like I do it in this Catuskotty four-valence logic way that Simondon doesn't explicitly do
mm.
because he never talks about Nagarjuna and all of that shit. But he explicitly says this is pre-physical and pre-vital,
Yeah,
and therefore obviously pre-psychic for him because the psychic is within the living world for
yeah,
Simondon.
yeah, yeah,
Um, it's prior to all those distinctions, and at a certain point we're just going to hit somewhere where we can't say it can't be qualified by determinate qualities, right? Because it's under determination itself,
yeah,
like itself is already a stupid way of putting it. It's just under determination, shut up. And
yeah,
then the question is, and this is the Darwinian and I think Simondonian question about the now you're going to go into some analogical mode of reasoning, which is what Simondon is doing, right? And so when you start talking about pre-individuality and trying to keep it as vague as possible, but building determinacy, you're going to have recourse to, quantum mechanics and, all the different paradigms
mm.
that Simondon will have, energetic flux of some kind. And, he can be criticized readily by Stengers for using the word energy in a vague way, right? Because
Mm. Mm.
energy requires a metric actually in
Yeah,
physics. you
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
the of the metric, but I mean, it's energeia in a sense, maybe. I mean, it's like it's just, but it's prior to the distinction between actuality and virtuality as well.
Mm.
Those distinctions have to, and this is Hegel's attempt as well, right? And this is what I think Hegel is in a way doing the right thing at this point in my, because speculative philosophy, for me, is an active imagination, and it's about getting to those limits of abstraction and going like, this is as far as I can go, and then trying to let the thing rebuild itself. I
Mm.
mean, the problem for me is that he doesn't really think that science and all that has anything to say, I think,
Who is that?
about Hegel.
Oh, Hegel.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Hegel's problem is basically that he's a necessitarian and that his idea is that the thing is an integrated whole from the beginning in some
Yeah.
sense. And
Yeah.
I'm like,
But that's
no,
again because he swallows existence
yeah,
in
yeah,
intellect. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that to me but I think that's a very classical move.
Yeah.
That's
I
what
mean,
I
it's
worry.
similar to the everything is just a computer. Like our whole reality is like existing on some computer.
Well,
It's
yeah,
like the
but it's a
homunculus, but like the ground
yeah.
of being homunculus problem. And I mean, essentially, Hegel wants to say there's these like three syllogisms, and they
Mhm.
each feed off the other and give to the next. And there's three of them, so they each give
Well,
what the other one needs. And
it's exactly what, again, autopoeticists and even the organizational account, which I think is great in a lot of ways. Stuart Kaufman's Closure of Constraints. Hegel is trying to do that in a completely abstract way and give us an image of an autopoietic being, which is completely self-contained.
yeah,
Uh, and what it ends up being is an explaining away of all contingency, because there's necessity, like with a capital N, and the unfolding of the concept, and in its making explicit of itself to itself, it needs to enter the contingent material world. It needs to externalize,
yeah,
but basically that process of what like epigenesis, or really it's evolution in the old classical sense of unfolding. Um, is a process of explaining away the contingency to,
yeah,
I feel like this is a little bit what Bianchi is saying Aristotle does, by the way,
yeah,
but like saying, yes, there is contingency, there's deformity, blah, 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 but that's always a bad thing. And it's not a generative thing.
yeah.
It is what ends up getting explained away.
I mean, this is what Bergson says about Aristotle too.
Yeah.
That like he grants that like ontologically it makes no sense to rid ourselves of contingency. We no longer understand our own activity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
and again it gains us freedom, but it's not a gain to Aristotle or to the Greeks. It's a diminution
yeah.
from the fullness of necessity. Yeah,
Yeah, this is the big difference between the Darwinian mode, which I don't claim is fully original to Darwin, because it seems like Empedocles and Anaximander were maybe doing that to some degree. And
yeah,
so it's perhaps always been there as a minoritarian thesis in the Deleuzian sense or
yeah,
whatever, but that I call it Darwinian because of his obvious position in history. He's the manifestation of absolute spirit at that time in history. Teasing. But he is saying that contingency doesn't get explained away. It is the basis of the ongoing construction of novelty, right? It gets stabilized.
right.
And this is fundamentally then the difference between most physical theory, which is Hegelian, um, you know, because that's also classically theological in an important sense, right? So it's not only Hegelian, to me, it is the core of
Mm,
kind of classical rationalism,
mm,
going back to Aristotle,
mm.
if not to, I mean, Plato is a much more ambiguous case, I think,
Yeah,
but um, it seems to be even though Aristotle has all the other shit in his thought as well, it seems to be the dominant way he wants to understand things, right?
mm,
um, is that, yeah, contingency will be explained away, and essentially evolution, or the appearance of evolution, because in someone like Laplace or whatever, this just get completely collapsed.
mhm,
It would only be the appearance of contingency or appearance
yeah,
of possibility to finite minds. But even if it's real contingency, like it is for Aristotle and and Hegel, they're already in a way in the statistical mechanics position where they're like, oh, contingency does contribute to the specific formation
Mm.
of like, the concrete truth,
Yeah.
but the form actually of that concrete truth, not exactly its position or where it was going to be instantiated or
Mm.
in who or whatever, but the form of it is already completely contained within the axioms, basically, or the initial conditions and entailing laws in statistical mechanics.
Yeah.
So there is a way that the contingency gets explained away or is subjugated, basically. It's the subjugation of difference to identity, to put it in a Deleuzian register.
Yeah.
Um, and it's all just in service of reaching a particular pre-specified goal. And that's an optimization model or an
Right.
optimality model.
I mean, this
That,
is just the retrograde move of the intellect for
yeah,
Bergson. And again, like it's great and it works really well and it does all of these things. And I mean, I'm actually reading this book right now that argues for Plato having like a quasi evolutionary view of ethics and
oh
that
yeah,
he like hides it and that
yeah,
like the code and the irony and all of the dramatic things. It's actually a reading very close to to my own reading of Plato.
oh
Uh,
yeah.
but it would be that like, and this like goes to his reading of Homer and I don't know if you've seen the Odyssey.
I have
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah,
But I mean, I've been thinking about. I mean, one of the core themes of the Odyssey that I think is picked up by Plato is this sense of being trapped in the cycles of violence from
yeah,
history, and it's like Agamemnon does this thing, and now Orestes kills his mom, and then now they're gonna kill somebody, and it's just like this ongoing shit, that you
it's the
can't get
wheel.
out of.
It's the wheel of samsara. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just the inescapable and like everything's about being trapped in that story, like trapped in a cave, trapped on
yeah,
an island with these things. You're at the
yeah,
Lotus Eaters, or you're like stuck with Calypso, whatever. Like,
yeah,
and then like Penelope's trapped in her thing, doing like weaving and like trapped in her own house, like whatever. Like, and then the whole, leaving home, coming back home, and just okay. Anyway, all of those themes in a psychological sense of like how do we move somewhere else and get to a better
yeah,
place, because I mean the theme of platonic, like the platonic philosophy, but before that, even going back to Hesiod, is like shit has gotten worse. Like in the ancient times, like the ancient for them, things were
golden.
better.
Yeah, it was
and,
the
and
golden age.
like and like yeah, the golden age and all this and everything has degraded, and it's like we can't go back to the golden age, or at least like let's say that this is Plato's position, like we can't
Yeah,
go back to the golden age, and yet we're trapped in this like cycle of history. How do we exit and like genuinely do something new? And maybe like genuinely doing something new is kind of imitative of what the ancient golden people
yeah,
did, but
yeah,
it's not a return to their lifestyle because it's not possible. But
yeah,
how do we return to something better than living in shit, basically? And the violence and like all of this kind of thing. And like I think Odysseus like
yeah,
represents that versus Achilles. Because right, Achilles is like, I have my values and I just stand up for them. And
yeah,
like maybe that means I die young, but like that's a life more worthwhile than like whatever, versus this itinerant, and even like the peripatetics have this kind of itinerant
yeah,
sense to them, where there is so much of this kind of sense of return or perenniality or all of this, but there's also a very genuine sense that they need to invent something and escape from the past. So anyway, that's a long, like soft, and you brought up, narrative and these things. So I think
yeah,
it's important.
yeah,
I do think there's a narrative tone to Plato and Aristotle
yeah,
that has this kind of evolutionary, and more so even in Plato than in
yeah,
Aristotle,
yeah,
and
yeah,
what I'm
yeah,
realizing more and more.
yeah,
But
yeah. I think that that's absolutely right. I
yeah,
worry, I suppose, that it is so hidden in a way that it's the minoritarian strain of their own thought. I mean, so Bianchi would say, and whatever, it's a reading, that it's symptomatic, and basically it's disavowed in Aristotle, right?
yeah,
You know, Plato,
that's the
is,
Bergsonian reading
yeah.
of Aristotle too. Yeah.
I mean,
And
so
other people say, I mean, Heidegger I think says this too, that like when he looks at time and he sees this like displacement and this like degradation and all of these things, he like runs and tries
Yeah,
to
yeah,
grab
yeah, yeah.
onto something solid, and like
Because we're kind of afraid to die and all that. Yeah. I mean, yes. I of course I think that this rationalist kind of necessitarian thesis is in a way fundamentally soteriological. It is fundamentally I call it apotropaic reason, right? I mean, it's very Nietzschean to say something like that. And I was also getting Nietzsche vibes and sort of Deleuze reading Nietzsche in what you were saying about like eternal return of difference,
yeah.
you know. Um, that's what we need to get back to is the capacity to
And
genuinely.
Aristotle does like describe something close to that, not only in the passages in Physics 4 on time, but then when he comes in Physics 8 to talk about the unmoved mover and things like that,
Yeah,
he says at one point that what the unmoved mover guarantees is novelty, is displacement, that
mm,
no two nows will ever be the same, that
yeah,
there
yeah,
will never be like the stoic coming back to the same point. Now, of course, he has these transcendental structures, if you want to use that kind of term, where, the human form isn't evolving.
yeah.
So a million years from now, humans aren't going to look any different.
I
uh,
mean, it's obviously Hegel and Aristotle are quite different, but I think there's a similarity there in the sense that concretely things are going to be different at the level of like
yes.
particularity. Things
Well,
are going
they
to be
will
different.
certainly be
Oh,
different. Like you'll never
yeah,
have another Tim. There may be
yeah,
somebody who looks kind of like you or whatever, but like
yeah, yeah.
the details will always be.
Abstractly and formally,
Yeah,
they're going to be the same in some at some important sense. And I mean,
yeah,
that is just to say that. I mean, this is another can of worms, but it does. I mean, it would, if we were back to Whitehead and all of these things, the notion of abstract possibility and the way he tries to develop his scheme and the incurable atomicity of the actual and all of that. But there are ways in which I think we shouldn't hypostasize uh, forms of judgment which are just radically perspectival, and they're kind of, you can think of them as relative to scale, right?
yeah,
Like identity is a stipulative
mhm,
thing, right? You say these are the essential characters of the thing,
yeah,
and it will be that thing so long as those do not vary.
yeah,
These are non-essential characteristics of the thing, and those can vary, and it will still be the thing. And it's like totally fine and a really important analytic, well, not analytic, you know what I mean, like for
yeah,
analysis
yeah,
distinction to make. Absolutely incredibly important. Again, this is how an effective theory works, right? These are the relevant dynamics. These are irrelevant. This is the noise that basically doesn't even show up for this theory.
yeah.
Or is going to be explained away in a certain sense, like we're going to reach the targeted end goal despite traversing some unprestatable path.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and again, for precision's sake, and we need to make judgments of that kind all the time. And it is important for me to be, Tim. There's an aspect of my personality, and of course, there is a transductive. This is just evolutionary anyway. It's inheritance. There is a transductive continuity
Mhm.
that relevantly defines me as who I am. But obviously, at another level, I am a different person all the time. And we make a decision because of specific interests that we have um, to stipulate a certain level of identity.
Yeah,
And that's again, it doesn't take anything away from that procedure and say that, oh well, it's all bullshit, and actually it's all like indeterminate flux, and then we just cognitively or whatever do something miraculous and impose order on
yeah.
it. Like that's silly.
But
Um,
yeah, I mean, well,
but to
just
say there's a
mhm.
specific, sorry, to say there's a
Yeah,
specific kind of basis of reduction of identity, like this is the actual identity of the thing,
yeah,
and that's just a hypostatic move where your particular interests are now being taken to be ultimate and general, right?
yeah.
Um,
Are you
and
talking
that's it.
about just like the categories, like not category in the Aristotelian sense, but like the zoological forms that Aristotle is like, these are just, is that what you mean? Like the,
Well, it could be that. I mean, you could just say it's essence accident at some level, right? It's just saying like these are the essential categories. characteristics and these are accidental. And I'm just saying that is always that itself is a contingent judgment.
Sure.
That's a stipulation that you make. And this is again the problem with Hegel is that he's like, I'm going to screen out all the accidental shit, and I'm going to let the thought unfold itself in its own immanent essence.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
and I will be able to make the judgment essentially of what belongs to thought in itself and what is just noise. And
yeah.
it's like, yeah, you'll be able to make that judgment, but I mean, you're only recovering your own premises when
But
you make
I
that
mean,
kind of
this
judgment.
really gets to the core of what I'm trying to think with this, because I think what you're describing there, when you have the essence and you have this apprehension of it in thought,
Yeah, yeah,
for Hegel, we get this determinate closure where we have completeness and wholeness and all of this. But what I would say is that if we take this Whiteheadian view of eternal objects as like truly a process approach to this, and really do get it to fit in certain ways with Bergson and commitments of Peirce and others like this, and um, on the one hand, the infinity of eternal objects, we could say, demands that Aristotle's view of essences be incorrect. Like,
Hmm.
and I mean, I'm not going to like prove this to you like in absolute terms, but like the general idea would be that in order for Aristotle's forms, like for there to be the form of man or human or whatever like that, and then we could have that go for eternity, is only because there's a limited number actually of forms of
Mhm.
and that they have not just determinate or not just definiteness but determinateness, right? And if we, on the other hand, are committed to those other the Whiteheadian definitions of eternal objects, uh, they, in a way, I don't want to say necessitate, because I'm not saying that this abstract idea creates
Yeah,
the diversity of forms, but them being that way means that forms will change,
yeah,
because the potentiation through this definiteness is over, like it's again the idea of excess and
yeah,
surplus and all of this. The essence is uh, part of the problem for this kind of bundle theory of the self. Like the our essence, if you can let me use the word for a minute, like let's say that there's some kind of conatus or some kind of essence behind our life. It is radically incomplete and underdetermined in such a way that we will be forced to become different than ourselves in order for the essence to actually realize itself. And this is the kind of like uh, radical expressive pluralism, I
yeah,
think, that
yeah.
you can get with a certain view of eternal objects.
Yeah, well, there are heaps of questions that arise, and I want to talk about the fiction thing as well because I want to talk about concretization and where I thought you were going as well is, like a certain degree. This is also basically talking about enabling constraints,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but a certain degree of definiteness enables the construction of novelty, right? And I mean
Mm-hmm.
that's not unrelated to the redundancy novelty
Yeah.
discussion that we had either, but. Um, I mean, when you talk about the conatus as our essence, like I don't mind you stipulating essences. I just want you to say that they're stipulated. you know, um, the question will always
Well,
arise about.
I'm not comfortable saying a essence, like an essence is X, right? Like even that, like I'm like,
Exactly.
let's like entertain this for a minute, but like because you're already determining it into something.
Well, exactly the thing.
Yeah.
That's why I say that you can give examples of eternal objects, but they are not the operation of eternal objects itself, right? It can't be reduced to any example because all examples are in fact domain specific. So
Yeah.
you can stipulate for the purposes of investigation or entering or whatever reasoning about this domain that these are the eternal objects of that domain. But whenever you say something specific, like the question I would ask about the conatus is like if we were entertaining that it's the essence of the human, well, is it the contingent and constructed and evolved essence of the human, or is it something like eternal in some strong metaphysical sense that was always there, and didn't require a contingent history of construction in order to be
But
realized.
a contingent history of construction already implies, on the one hand, natural selection, like we were saying before. It
Yeah,
already implies abductive intensive variation. I would
but it's
say
just,
it already implies what?
I mean, abduction just is a
Yeah.
person
No,
attempting.
sure, exactly. It already includes, I would also say, like, directedness, or like and like morphology, and like complex morphology in which the whole is greater
Exactly.
and less than the sum of the parts.
And the question can be asked about any one of those requirements that you've mentioned, about what is required to get that. And that is a never-ending question that we can keep asking so long as we are defining or giving a degree of definiteness. So we can
Yeah.
always ask about, in my opinion, and it could be a very difficult and unanswerable question. Like, you might not be able to give a plausible account of the genesis of some form of definiteness, but that's very different from saying that there isn't a possible account of its genesis, right? Or that it has no genesis, and therefore is quote unquote uncreated in some strong metaphysical sense, right? So that's
But
essentially
you go to the same, like the genesis of the genesis problem, and like you
yeah.
ultimately end up with again, I think, like an importing from physical theory to an ultimacy premise. And I know that you don't want to do that, and I don't think you're doing
We're
that.
not.
But
Yeah.
if you want to ask the question about the genesis of natural selection,
Yeah.
right? I mean, again, every time it has a genesis, the
Yep.
genesis is very particular to the concrete circumstances in which it
100%.
arises. And then we say, like, okay, like all of these very different occurrences of natural selection, they have very different material realizations, they have completely different genetic, like, histories, and all of
100%.
this. Is anyone comfortable, like, saying that it was invented by something, or that it created itself, or like, and if we reject both of those, like, I don't know, I mean, like,
Well, we don't
yeah.
have to. We don't have, you voiced the right concern, right, for me, which is that if you're winding back, winding back, you are eventually going to hit a wall, and that's the point at which you say, you don't speak about determinate origins. You are doing this kind of speculative generalization where you are trying to say, this is the undeconstructible in Derridian terms or whatever. Like, this is the limit that I can get to. And beyond that, it's just underdetermined. But as soon as you step back into specificity, and absolutely, like, I
But
think,
underdetermined again is like, I mean, I really like the way you that you use underdetermined and all of this, but there is evidence of underdeterminants
yeah.
that we have. Like, I talked about in my talk, like, Gestalt diagrams.
Well,
That
there are manifestations. It's just the same thing about, like, if I talked about the eternal object as a generic operation, right? Then you can go and talk about examples, but they're not the same. Those are examples that are in specific domains, and this is the
But
operation.
eternal object already swallows operation in a way, because you're saying, like, here's the operations of eternal objects. Well, operation itself is going to be one of the, and I say one is always like problematic
Yeah,
again, but
yeah,
and I, I've been rattling these things off, and you keep saying that they're the same, like natural selection and abductive intensive variation and things like that. But, like, I do think that those, I mean, this is where my talk was trying to say is, on the
yeah,
one hand, we need operative intelligence in order to open the question of latent intelligibility, but
yeah,
also they operative intelligence is latent
yeah,
in an important way, and I think is, even for Whitehead, part of the eternal objects. Like, part of the eternal objects is the attitudes that we have, is the kind of formal reality or operative directedness, or however you want to say it,
Yeah, I mean the direction thing is another issue that we would need to address. When I talk about sort of natural selection or something, and I normally don't use the term natural selection, but obviously that is the schema. I talk about evolutionary reasoning or this Darwin Purcell Wanton triad or something like that, right?
I'm pulling the Deacon. I just reread the evolution chapter because I remember you mentioned it at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I am saying we go in search of a minimal operative schema, right? And it being minimal means that these are we have intended to discover things that are not just operations amongst a coordinate multiplicity, infinite multiplicity of coordinate operations. These are the operations from which other operations are potentially derivable.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'm not saying that there's a unique one of those, like there's a unique minimal operative schema. I'm saying the task of what I call like the speculative aspect of philosophy is to go in search of some minimal operative schema. Like beyond the minimal operative schema, you're just sitting there and you're meditating and you're just back in prosaic reality, basically, right?
Yeah.
You just end up returning to prosaicness on the other side of that. And then you do hit my conception of Persian firstness,
Mhm.
which is not bare actuality. Like some people are like, oh
Mhm.
no, when you're talking about you're collapsing
Mhm.
Persian firstness, and I'm like, no, because all of that latency is actually part of
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
Because there is no like nature at an instant. There
Mhm.
is no present moment
Yeah.
except in
Right.
our. In
Yeah.
fact, what happens in prosaicness is it keeps fucking changing.
Yeah.
It keeps
Continuity.
it keeps revealing its underdetermined nature by becoming something else.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so firstness is
But
possibility.
that's again like the irreversibility and
Yeah,
constraints make work. Like I think that when we look at the firstness,
yeah,
it has certain invariable qualities.
yeah.
And
Well,
those are variation and irreversibility
yeah.
and that constraints make work and these kinds of things.
You're already, yeah. Too many things being said because we've already moved into speculative generalizations from the experience, right? At that point, so those might be warranted speculative generalizations, but the experience is just the experience of that. All I was saying is like on the other
But
side.
the experience, yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is I completely agree with you like that. Like what I just said
Yeah,
is in the language of an
yeah,
investigative
yeah,
reapproach
yeah,
to the
yeah, yeah,
but these are the like this is what in phenomenology they would say is like these are the structures of that are like necessarily always
yeah.
already at play.
I mean,
Like
that's just a transcendental argument. Yeah, right.
I mean you have this like forget about any intellectual categories or cognitive whatever. You have a synthesis of moments, and whether that's in a consciousness that's gathering up the past and connecting it with the present, or whether that's differences that accumulate in order to make a difference morphologically or in just like brute variation or whatever, like um, those are properties of first list.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are ways that we describe firstness
But
in,
see, yeah, okay, keep
in,
going. Sorry.
well, they're ways that we describe firstness in terms of things that are also secondness and thirdness. And so directionality is thirdness, and secondness is that there are differences that are relating to each other, that are banging into each other or whatever. Selection, selecting each other, deviating each other or whatever. I'm saying like I was literally just talking about a contemplative experience without any story attached to it, right?
Yeah.
Of course, as soon as you start doing philosophy again, you start saying all the stuff,
But
which
what
is
I'm saying is at the level of before the story. Like that's what I'm trying to get at.
but I don't think you open your mouth, you're in the story.
I mean,
Um,
sure, we could never talk about it or never say anything, but I
I'm not
think
saying
that yeah,
I'm not saying that we I'm not saying that we should never talk. I talk a great deal. It's
yeah,
very hard to shut me
no, of
up.
course, of course. But I
But
mean, this is like the like irreversibility is exists before it's a concept and exists before we have any investigative thing about it, and like and
yeah,
ultimately if we make the move from firstness to secondness and investigate firstness and then come up with
Yeah.
the idea of irreversibility, it was in firstness the whole time and never stopped being.
Well, and I mean, also we could go into inquiry,
Yeah,
right? And we could do cosmology as an actual science, and
yeah,
we could find that holy shit, there was like, 13 point, 8 something billion years of irreversibility before we discovered the concept of irreversibility.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's another way of telling a story about it. But I am saying that we can have experiences that are not that are, of course, as soon as you tell a story about them, they're mediated because
mhm,
you are a kind of being in a particular location having a kind of experience, right?
yeah,
But we can remove all of the speculative mediation of the experience and just have the experience. But what we're trying to do, I
yeah,
think, in a kind of first philosophy or whatever, is we're moving from that I am just sitting, like Zazen thing. There's no fucking story, right? If you start telling a story, I hit you with my cane. We can move from that. Um, and to try and find a minimal schema which will do justice to the reality of that experience and enable us to tell stories about it, but presume as little as possible about. So it will have to abstract something general from that experience, but try to get away as much as possible from the particularities of that experience, which are its contingency on us being the kinds of organisms that we are. Um, and that's when we're trying to tell a story because we're also going to be going into inquiry. We're going to be, to the extent that we're capable, assessing the breadth of scientific knowledge, etc. We're going to be reading stories and listening to music and doing all the other things that we do to differentiate our understanding of reality. And then we're going to try and build a story. Like we almost never actually experience the kind of limit of prosaicness. It's a kind of a rarefied experience that we have to practice. Well, on the one hand, we have to practice to maintain it. On the other hand, it's always
yeah.
here.
It's there already.
Um,
Yeah, I mean that's the duration question was
yeah,
there. So yeah,
exactly, exactly. And I think that's very much what Buddhists almost generically sort of saying, and most contemplatives are saying in some way or another, is that if you just learn to pay attention, you will see that this is what things are always like.
yeah,
I'm just using that as a particular limit of a stance that we take towards the world, right? So
mhm,
prosaic, quiet, and speculative are just different stances, and they're normally all bound up in each
yeah,
other. And I just try to separate them, which is itself an abstraction. Um, but you can try and concretize that abstraction as much as possible in a practice, like just sitting or whatever.
yeah,
I just try to separate them so that we don't accidentally conflate things, and we try to minimize the way, for example, that we go from our experience and say, oh, this aspect of my experience is in fact like metaphysical or whatever. So again, that we don't just trivially conflate thought and being in some way, right? Because we're going to use
yeah,
inquiry to mediate that. And the
mm,
difference between inquiry, what I was saying right at the beginning, the difference between inquiry and just sitting, or even just lived experience in general and what appears for us, but what we've learned about the world, it seems to be like pretty solid from inquiry, because there's a difference there, and because inquiry involves very precise and very specific operations of abstraction over experience and the building of, um, technical objects on the basis of those abstractions that enable us to peer further into and expand possible experience and all that. Because there's a real difference there, speculation now has to emerge as a third,
mm,
has to itself emerge as some other form of mediation of,
mm,
of, of experience. And so when I say we're looking for a minimal operative schema of some kind, that's speculation to me, right? That is how, on the basis of experience, is inquiry actually going to be possible as well, right?
yeah.
So they're all in some way. It is a bit Hegelian when it's like, because they're all going to refer to each other, and they're going
But
to.
there's primacy to the prosaic.
Yes, yes, because there is, because when we're not telling a story about it, there's primacy to it. But then when we go into inquired, we're like, well, the prosaic is the way it is for humans such as us because of, like, a whole lot of evolutionary history.
Yeah.
It's not that this kind of experience is just cosmic or something, like it's
Mm.
just generic for
Okay.
everything.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, so I reject the kinds of um, generalizations partly from experience that are made by panpsychists in general, for example, right? I mean, there are different forms of panpsychism, and I'm
Mm,
obviously much more like I don't think Whitehead is not a panpsychist, and I don't particularly love the term pan-experientialism, but there's a big difference between what he and in fact a lot of classical idealists, including Hegel, but Peirce would be doing that would make them panpsychists and what a kind of analytic, substance property type panpsychism is doing. Those are totally different things. But in either case, I would problematize the generalization. But that's a whole other
no, it's a,
conversation.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about that question as well, coming after the Whitehead conference, and like the pantheism, panentheism distinction.
Yeah.
Like somebody has made this distinction. I forget who it is, but it was like derived from Indian philosophy, but like a
Yeah.
panenpsychism,
Oh
which
yeah.
doesn't really like work as a word, but like indicates this same
Yeah.
sort of move where uh everything is within psyche rather than psyche being within everything, and then the psyche exceeding what what it contains.
Yeah,
uh,
but not for inquiry. Like for prosaicness, there is an important sense in which that's true. Like everything turns out to be in here in some sense, right? But the kinds of inferences we make on the basis of experience, like for example, your independent existence outside my psyche, but inquiry
well,
kind of
this would
interpret.
not be saying
Not
everything
so.
exists in a psyche,
No, I know.
in a personal psyche. I mean, this
Yeah,
goes for the like quasi Platinian
yeah,
that I
yeah,
think Bergson genuinely continues this element, even though he rejects the eternal object essence kind of realm.
yeah, yeah,
Everything exists within the Elan Vital, and
yeah,
it's the kind of like uh, twisting in on itself of that original uh, super
yeah,
psyche. um,
yeah. Which is
as
which is
it
what.
dissociates from its integral self into particular being. So the only way to have psychological interiority
Yeah,
is to dissociate from the larger
yeah, sure.
encompassing psyche. Yeah.
Which is Elan Vital as pre-individuality in a way, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
plane of immanence, like
I mean, it's the
those.
duration of all durations kind of
Yeah,
piece.
yeah, and then there are a bunch of like I used to like a phrase like infinite subdivisions of the cosmic beat or something, but there are ways that we don't want to think about that, which is exactly like that. We don't want because
Yeah.
that's nesting. That's
Yeah.
nesting, We don't
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
say there's some fundamental rhythm
Right.
and that every other differentiation is a subdivision of that.
Yeah.
Because what I mean, the big enemy, as far as I'm concerned, is unitarity, as you know. Like um, that. I think Deleuze is basically right on this, but he credits Jean Wall as
Mhm.
as the guy who was all about this.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Wall is talking about unity and all this stuff all the
Mhm.
time, but he's also saying that there is no totality.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I
and so
mean, through all of our conversations, you've
yeah,
said many times, like being just against unity in general is not the goal. I mean, like there are unities, like
yeah,
and and
yeah,
like even consciousness has a unitive. And I think like Bergson is actually really good on this, but same like Merleau-Ponty is maybe better
yeah,
on this. That there's a unitive, synthetic aspect of consciousness, but it's
yeah,
always incomplete and it's
yeah,
always partial and
yeah,
it's ongoing, so like
yeah,
the unity never stops being introduced, but it's
yeah,
always
yeah,
incomplete and it's always won at the cost of like sectioning off and blocking out. Like, and I think that this is experientially or phenomenologically like, the only
yeah,
way you can listen to a melody is by blocking out the noise, right? And like certain like not hearing things in the background that would distract you from.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
And like you've said in your piece a little bit, and obviously we discussed in China to some degree, you get better at hearing music where the noise is very constitutive, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I
And,
mean you
and
have constitutive noise, but
yeah, and necessarily the dominance
mm,
of any particular melody is
mm,
going to diminish, and that's why a lot of people hear that music and go, "Oh, it's not melodic." And I mean,
mm,
in some
mm,
important sense, it might not be melodic, right?
mm, mm,
Um, but
Well, and
there's
melody is not the only ingredient in music.
but it also might be, this would be like I know you're enamored of Schoenberg and developing variation. It might in some way be hypermelodic.
Mm,
It's just that you can't perceive it as traditionally or standardly
yeah,
melodic. There are too many melodies,
yeah,
and they keep interfering with each other in a
right.
way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And and an interesting and very stimulating way to make
yeah.
music. It makes a particular kind of demand on a listener. Um, yeah.
I mean, I
Uh,
think that like I think we agree that unity is a real feature of the natural and biological world.
yes,
Unity is a real achievement
yes, exactly.
of life and biology,
Yeah,
and that it's something that isn't accountable for through like uh, just brute mechanical
yeah,
causality and this kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But there are a million problems that come on as soon as you make unity the
yeah,
question. And I think that the like I mean most people now when you say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and less, like
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
this line, like everybody knows this line now.
yeah,
And my work on Aristotle, I credit this to Aristotle to some degree. I mean, he definitely says the whole is something besides the parts.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
and that gets taken by the Gestalt psychologists in this way. But the question of unity there and oneness, manyness, or moreness and lessness, or all of these questions, um, that I mean, there's a conceptual barrier that we hit. So on the one hand, we need to rethink unity in order to think life, and even more so, I would say, in the psychological. I mean, there's a multiplicity within the psychological that is never subsumed within the unitive, and there's a unitive that is unperturbed by the continued existence of multiplicity. And that unitive is not something complete and finished, and these kinds of things, ongoing,
yeah,
unending thing that eventually maybe ends up somewhere else than what its original state. So I do subscribe to some kind of bundle. I've recently been thinking maybe, and I hate this title, and I was like, shit, I guess I'm a hyper bundle theory. And I was like, that name really sucks.
yeah.
But like, there is some kind of bundle, but there is a virtuality to it that isn't accountable by Hume. I mean, if for Hume you have this set of associations, well, clearly we can't make all those associations at once, or
No,
maybe only under like the right
yeah,
psychedelic mixture or
yeah.
something like that. But like enlivening all of our associations at once isn't possible. But who we are is the playing out of those associations, right?
That's why I think the temporal piece, the
Yeah,
inherited piece, the transductive piece in
yeah,
Simondon is very useful here because that unity and the way we keep recapitulating relations
yeah,
that are not always present, because as you
yeah,
say, if they were present all at once, it would be like the worst caricature of Schoenberg.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like we would be in a fair bit of trouble, right?
Right.
But we do all this work in living the life of the mind. We do all this work to kind of make these transductive relations
Yeah.
more coherent, more
That's the
we keep
work constraint piece
yeah,
that we've been hitting on.
well,
Yeah.
we keep in a sense trying to create a degree of unity. I think that one of the basic points that I would just make there is that when you make unity fundamental as opposed to an achievement, so when you make it the a priori,
Mm,
in some sense, right, then you are actually in the mechanical framework. That is exactly how you mechanize unity,
mm,
and that's why all of the physical theory and the critique of unitarity that I'm making in physical theory, and this is also a critique of reductionism, obviously, because there isn't a privileged unitary basis of reduction for all these different individually or
yeah.
independently unitary theories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, right, so it's a critique of the idea of the grand unified theory, which we
Yeah. Yeah.
briefly
Yeah.
earlier, which has always been the classical rationalist wet dream,
Of
right?
course. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, there, like seeing how that's not possible, or seeing what really infelicitous consequences it must have in terms of all that it has to explain away,
Yeah.
like contingency becomes just an appearance or
Yeah.
non-generative or whatever, all of that has to be something that we take on board and use to critically interrogate the history of philosophy
Yeah.
that was basically using unity in general in just a radically less precise way.
Yeah.
Like happens in modern science and modern mathematics is that the notion of unity gets defined vastly more precisely.
Yeah.
Uh,
But within its own domain space. And like
yeah,
we want a precise definition of unity in psychology that's going to be unique. And
yeah.
I think that, I mean, a student recently asked, does the whole change when we understand the whole? Or does it stay the same? It's like a great like
Yeah, yeah.
metaphysics like we
Yeah, yeah,
can't
yeah.
answer this question for sure, but like where does it how does it force you to think about how you would answer that? And I think, I mean, my answer was basically when we do this thing that I was blaming Aristotle and Whitehead for, which is like we do take something that we've experienced before. Like we have experience of unity in certain ways. You know, like literally our perceptual apparatus, our sensory motor system and its habits are geared towards finding unities constantly. Like that's what the schematism is for Kant. Like our imagination loves unity and like is always searching for unity. And we were talking about this with narrative theory and stuff. Like it's only a
Well,
narrative insofar as it creates a certain amount of unity, even if that unity is incomplete or like these kinds of things.
well, also, I mean, there is this, again, soteriological apotropaic function here.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to be a crude evolutionary psychologist, but, there are reasons that we want to explain away the alterity, right?
Yeah.
It is threatening, and often our unity is so hard won, and often we're so invested in it before we even became consciously aware
Right.
that we
Right.
were
Right.
right? Just
Yeah.
as organisms that were interpolated and interpolating and doing all this shit,
Well, and
getting
in human life, like you have to stand up for yourself and you have to like
yeah,
answer
yeah,
for yourself. And like you have to do
yeah.
all these things that like reinforce a sense that there's this
But you can
core unitive
but you can be
identity.
kind of pathologically incentivized,
Yeah.
and this is where it becomes like in academia, we are incentivized to be egoic in an important sense, or you can be incentivized to imagine this competition between unities and all these things. And
Yeah.
of course, nationalism, race, we can talk about all the nasty
Yeah.
aspect. Why there is a very fraught ethics of
Yeah.
unity. And that's why we need to emphasize the constitutive, in fact, nature of alterity, the fact that unity is. I mean, I will even say, because of my thesis on underdetermination and overproduction variation and all of that, that unity is derivative.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, like you said, it's an achievement. So I will say that it doesn't, it is something that is necessary to keep achieving.
Yeah.
But we talk about this in terms of this, pros hen thing and health. And health, this is not necessarily incompatible with thinking in terms of a pros hen, but health really is the capacity to be otherwise.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and
and
I
like,
would say that exactly about unity. Like unity is an achievement, like unitivity within life, let's say, and
yeah,
and consciousness is an achievement won through adaptation and through changing.
yeah.
Um,
Which is itself contingent upon alterity. So
yeah,
it's a way of entering into relation with alterity and allowing the unity to be re-achieved in a
yeah,
sense. Like you can't be closed in a formal sense,
yeah,
You've got to be open to continuous deviation by alterity.
yeah,
And that contributes to the, you can say, metastability in a somewhat facile sense, but the dynamic kinetic stability,
yeah,
that's a little bit too physicalist, but of this contingent unity that is
yeah.
entirely contingent upon alterity.
Well, I mean,
Um,
there are these like you know, general psychological tendencies. We can perceive sights and sounds and even multiple sounds at the same time, but you get in a room with a bunch of conversations around you, it's not possible to sit there and listen to all the conversations. Like
no.
you do funnel into
Yeah,
these
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And so consciousness is constantly working in this way of creating insulations,
Well, and
temporary insulations. But the fact is, just because I can switch them doesn't
yeah,
mean I can disable the
yeah.
Like I will always be dissociating. I can modulate my dissociations and try
Yes.
and escape from like the fugue state, or just like
Yeah.
not noticing like obvious evident truths around me or something like that, right? Like
Well, I
I
was
can
just
try and get out of the echo chamber, what all these things, but you
yeah, I
can't
was
stop the mental tendency towards unicity.
yeah. But I mean, I was telling you the story, I think, in where we talked about this exact thing in China about, a time when I was having a really hard time mentally, and I had to sit in crowded rooms
Mm.
and specifically perturb the function of consciousness by attending to, like, by just doing open monitoring in crowded rooms,
Yeah,
basically, to the extent that I was trying to achieve a certain kind of unity and to bracket, I was becoming very anxious.
yeah,
Uh,
right.
so the only way I could deal with that anxiety at the time was just by letting all of that, and I mean, this is very akin to a kind of psychedelic
Mm.
situation in which your unity is being threatened, you
Yeah,
know, just a classic and now an
yeah,
incredible cliche, dissolution, or like Jung would say, abaissement du niveau mental, a
yeah,
lowering of the level of consciousness.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and you resist, and that's how to have a really bad trip, right?
yeah,
Like at some point you just got to go, fine, I will dissolve,
yeah,
you know, and that's partly contingent though on having faith that you will reconstitute a unity at another time,
yeah,
but that this particular unity that you are like grasping, it just can't. It's not
yeah,
adapted, basically.
yeah,
It's not suitable for this particular onslaught or whatever that's going on.
yeah,
It's run course. It needs to be allowed to die. And we get into very mythic language very easily. You need to do some katabatic shit.
mm.
You need to go to the underworld, let that
Yeah,
thing die, and then have faith that you'll be able to come back out of that and
yeah,
reconstitute a novel unity, which is going to be more apt precisely because of the degree to which it entered into alterity and let itself be deviated
yeah,
by it. And this is just pre-individuality in Simondon, and his ethics, is basically
yeah,
like is the commitment to not becoming a total individual, right?
yeah, yeah.
Uh, to
But
letting
so
all,
okay, two things I want to say, and I realize we've been going for almost 3 hours now, but and I do want to keep going, as you know.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but uh, so I think that the exact description coming of individuation coming from Simondon
yeah,
and piecing in these things and the whole thing on Pros Hen in a generous reading of Pros Hen, whatever,
yeah,
all of this uh, reeks of eternal object constraint. Like
yeah,
again, like you don't get work without constraints, and like there's just these like you don't have consciousness that isn't directed in some way, doesn't have ofness of some kind. Like there's these, yeah, it feels like we're coming back to
yeah,
these, and of course they're coarse grains, they're abstractions, they're whatever,
yeah,
but they're
yeah, yeah.
also the most concrete things around. And like and it just is the case that reality must be described this way. And I'm not saying there couldn't be an epoch in which maybe it's different, or maybe
Yeah.
there's a universe or whatever the fuck you want to say,
Well,
but like
but
yeah,
you're willing in that case, I think, to read Whitehead in a certain way where you aren't necessarily going to take on board every single thing he has to say about eternal objects, right?
yeah,
So you might be willing to say that you might not need to say that they are uncreated if they are epochally distinct, for example, right? If there are eternal objects that are associated, say like the general operation is that an epoch will have eternal objects, right? But that any given epoch has distinct eternal objects. Then any given eternal object that you could name or speak about, any form of definiteness that you could point towards, verbally, conceptually, whatever, um, has a specific genesis associated with the genesis of that epoch, which you may or may not be able to give a satisfactory account of. But that doesn't mean, like, your inability to do that doesn't mean that these things are, absolute in some, absolutely uncreated in some metaphysical sense, right? You're just saying that there is. So let me ask the question in a more pointed way, right?
yeah,
So I've said there's an operation
mm-hmm.
called, eternal objectivity or something, right? Whatever, like eternal objecting, I don't know, whatever would be the better way of putting that, right? Um, and of course I can joke and I can say, sure,
I
you
mean
can
I
have
would say like pre-existing conformal constraints. or something
Yeah.
like that,
And they would be
potentiating actualization and work.
yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and they would be characteristic. They would yeah they would be a character that there are such things would be a characteristic of any definable situation, something like that, right?
yeah,
Okay, I've agreed with that already. Like I've said that this is a generic operation. I'd say it has a level of slightly less generic nature because it is characteristic of a situation, not characteristic of a non-situation in some sense. And
yeah.
there is a way in which loci have to be constituted from the non-local in some
Mm,
sense,
hmm,
right? And that's where creativity comes in, and that's where I think, Simondon and Darwin in a very different. Darwin doesn't know that he's doing this at all, right? Like Darwin doesn't care about these kinds of questions. As far as I mean, not so much, right? He's talking about very specific empirical problems, and obviously you'd be able, like, at least in on the origin, he's like, he references Newton's timeless laws and blah blah blah, and whatever. Of course, Darwin is a biologist who's taking all the other stuff totally for granted. Fine, but we're doing metaphysics, and we're talking about a mode of reasoning that he instantiates, not the way he applies it to specific examples, right? And I'm saying, like, in a way,
yeah,
Simondon and Darwin are relatively unique in the sense that they're tarrying in the liminal space between what in Whitehead would be creativity and the PNG eternal object relationship. Whereas Whitehead is like, whoop, he just jumps over it, right? It's like, this is absolutely irrational, right?
yeah,
But I'm agreeing basically that for any locus, there is, the operation of eternal objectivity or whatever. I'm, as you know, saying one of my slogans is that there's no locus of loci, right? So
mm,
those loci don't all fit into something that's
yeah,
locus-like.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
the non-local is not just a big locus.
Mm,
Like that just doesn't make sense.
yeah,
Um, but and then for any given thing, you might be able to actually give examples of eternal objects, just like in any given domain. Like for Darwin, you could give examples of variations because you would say, like, this is the trait. And in now we could do it way more precisely than Darwin because we can do a molecular evolutionary reconstruction of history, and we can say this is the plesiomorphic, that's close to ancestral type,
mm,
character state, and here are all these variations of it, which are specific to lineages at any level of definition, from, like, very ancient lineages, through down or up the hierarchy of the classificatory schema to individuals, and this could be just individual variants, but we're still saying, like, it inherited something from its lineage and it deviated it in this way, right?
yeah,
So there you are not talking about variation as such. You're
mm,
talking about a specific variant, right?
mm, mm,
And
mm,
that's all that, to be honest, that's all I'm trying to say. But this does seem to create problems for some Whiteheadians because Whitehead is also invested in this notion of the uncreatedness of the infinite but predefined multiplicity of them. To me, that's just a fudge, basically. Like, I'll just say that
yeah,
now, polemically. That's just like,
yeah,
way on. Oh, well, we're never going to run out of them because we have an infinite. Don't worry about that. We have an infinity of them. Um, like, okay. Infinity to me is most, I mean, we talked about this a bit in China, but, like, especially the way mathematicians use infinity, is mostly a fudge for taming difference and kind of waving away
mm,
detail.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so I think if we just go, like, Whitehead is trying to move to this, like, purely operative kind of conception of metaphysics where these are the generic operations, blah blah blah. In specific domains, you have specific eternal objects. Fine, I'm going to be cool with all of that. I'm not going to use the term eternal object. It's not going to be exactly Whitehead's conception, obviously, but latent intelligibles, obviously. Like, I've always, in all my conversations with Matt,
mm,
for however many years we've been talking, I've always said, yes, there is. I mean, I may have used different terms. Obviously, possibility is real,
mm,
uh, but abstract possibility is derived from concrete possibility. That's a new way of saying it because that's specifically John Wall is basically
yeah,
saying
yeah,
that. But yeah, I mean, it's just like saying adjacent possibles in a sense,
mm,
and they are, like, to me, they're quasi-definite
mm,
because they're not going to, like in Bergson, they're not really going to be definite until they are in fact instantiated.
yeah,
Um, Definiteness and determinacy do collapse into each other in an important sense there.
mm, mm,
Um, so blah blah blah.
yeah.
What would you disagree with about all of that, I suppose?
Well,
And
I guess two, yeah.
what
What
are
was that?
eternal, what are eternal objects for you?
Well, I think I gave a somewhat of a description definition a minute ago, which is
Yeah.
uh, uh, conformal constraint definiteness that
Mhm.
makes possible, and even I don't want to say makes possible because we're trying to be careful with the Bergsonian,
Yeah.
but that generates or is an integral part of the uh, genesis of novelty and form and work and actuality and these kinds of things. I mean, two things. I mean, we should probably wrap up and we'll continue this conversation in a
Well,
week
I
or
want
two.
to
But
give me your two things, then I want to ask a specific question, which I think will
okay,
lead onto a brief discussion of world building in
Mhm.
narrative
Sweet,
and concretization, and that could be somewhere we go in a future talk, but we
beautiful,
could go. So give
awesome.
me your two
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
Can I ask
Well,
a
yeah.
question?
I mean, one I would just say like I'm not convinced by the uh if there are eternal objects that are realized in multiple epochs
Yeah,
or that are realized exclusively in different
yeah,
epochs and aren't
yeah,
shared, something like that, then
yeah,
maybe we could just get rid of the idea of eternal. And I think that this leads back to my second point, which is uh the conception of eternal
yeah.
and just like what that word even means. And here I really don't have enough Whiteheadian.
Mhm.
I mean, I've read the passages where he talks about this.
Yeah,
Maybe there's
yeah,
other places where he talks. I mean, he talks about objective immortality as well, and makes that different than eternal objects. So
yeah,
that's an important thing. So again, I mean, object doesn't mean anything beyond content of experience. I'm a strong believer for Whitehead. Objectivity does not mean the objective world, mind independent world, or something like that. I know you know these things, but
like a
uh
psychic, but it is a that's radical empiricism, and like it's
yeah,
an affirmation of a kind of psychic reality. Jung would
yeah,
say psychic reality, but yeah,
yeah. Well, and it's again this kind of Cartesian in a way. I mean, Whitehead directly cites Descartes on the formal objective distinction,
yeah, right, yeah,
and objective just means the content, right?
yeah,
And so okay, the eternal piece I want to hit on is basically that um, insofar as the definiteness which reaches determinacy within its concrescence, like within its concrete assemblage or whatever you want to call it, within its concrete way of bringing together not
yeah.
only virtuality but actuality, right? The actualities of the past, the virtuality of the potential that we can, uh, you know, isn't reducible to the past or the actuality of the present.
Yeah.
Um, so when formation occurs, like when differences make a difference,
Yeah.
when variations become a new formation of something, there's like a a vein of necessity within it. Like there
Mhm.
is like a skeleton, if you will, of necessity that shows itself in there. It's kind of like consciousness is always feeling something. It's always aware of something. Now we have a completely new conscious experience that is not like anything we've ever experienced before,
Yeah.
but it is still awareness. It still has that. It still even
Yeah.
has like memory. It still has irreversibility.
Yeah.
Blah blah blah. Like it still has these features. And
Which are contingent on a domain called consciousness, like on a
sure, sure,
yeah,
but
which
but
which
but when
may not be eternal, right?
no, sure, it may not. It's actually definitely not eternal. It is. It is. It is temporal and in an
Yeah.
irreversible. It's caught
Yeah.
up with irreversibility.
Yeah.
But but when there is consciousness,
Yeah.
it has these things, and therefore it has this kind of skeleton, if you will, of
Yeah.
of necessity. And for Spinoza, eternity and necessity mean the same thing. So we
Yeah.
shouldn't think about eternity
Uh-huh.
as a temporal thing,
Yeah.
but just as like a causal thing.
Yeah.
Like it
Fine.
just is necessity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'm down with that. I'm down with that because that. I mean, this is specifically where I want to go with the discussion of fiction and narrative, actually, and concretization.
sweet.
But
Okay, so let's make
yeah.
that transition.
Well, no, I just want to say I'm down with that because you're saying that once this and these are not good terms, but once this system of relations um, comes into being, uh, that's a bad way of putting it as well, but is realized
Yeah.
and it may well have a genesis, right?
Mhm.
So it's not unconstructed or uncreated, but once it exists, um, or is real, all of these terms that we have to be like, oh my God, I can't even speak anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
That's where we should be.
then you can say that irrevocably associated with this domain are these latent aspects of that domain. Is this latent structure? And I'm like 100% on board. That is absolutely the case, right? So there are just multiple different kinds of claims being made, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what I'm saying when I'm saying once you define this domain, and I mean this is just literally what you do in a very abstract way with an effective theory, and you say like this is the basis, these are the states of possibility, this is the structure of the space of possibility, etc. You specifically um, don't give within the theory itself a genetic account of that structure of the
Mm.
theory, right? Like the theory cannot address its own conditions of possibility. So when you're inside the theory, basically, though all of those objects, possible contents, right, are eternal from within that theory, right? They do not admit of genesis from within the locus, right? And that's one of the reasons why the most general and abstract thought for metaphysics, for me, is the underdetermined, which is the non-local, which is the non-locus, right? Because it's only all you're saying at that point is that any locus cannot explain its own genesis.
Mm.
So there must be an excess to that locus, which is how it came to be, right? And I mean that's just it's kind of like incompleteness in like it's just the fact that um, axiomatic systems presuppose things that they don't themselves
Mhm.
explain, which is basically the axioms, right? So I mean, there are a
Well,
lot
and
of
the
different.
axioms, I mean, are in a way eternal object like at the
Yeah,
very least.
yeah, yeah,
If
yeah.
if they're not full on, I mean, like that a part is always less than the whole, right?
Mhm,
Like a part is always part of a whole. uh,
mhm.
I mean, these are like basic uh, constraint determinacy ways where it's like you can't really think the opposite of it. It's the structure, and maybe you can, but we'll be in such a radically different frame that it still won't make sense in this frame, right? Like, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It,
like see, you can have, paraconsistent logics and you can have all of this stuff where you can speak about domains and you can even talk about like someone like Michael Epperson giving a Whiteheadian account of quantum mechanics would talk about a specific aspect of realization which is prior to the PSR, prior to principle of non-contradiction. And that's what Simondon is trying to talk about with pre-individuality as well. Actually, Epperson, no shade, I love his work, but he wrote a little paper on Simondon some years ago and said basically Simondon and Whitehead are saying the same thing. That's totally wrong, but there is a similarity. It's almost like I feel like what Epperson is saying about quantum mechanics, at least at times, is more similar to Simondon than it is to Whitehead. But there's a domain of real, or there's an early stage of the realization of any definite content, which is prior to, law of the excluded middle, prior to the principle of non-contradiction and stuff. And those are achieved distinctions in an important sense, right? And
yeah,
that's what Simondon is saying, pre-individuality is prior to any logic, and we would have to pluralize logics,
mm,
right? And indeed, that is what has happened in 20th century logic, right?
yeah.
But
Which doesn't mean that they're like invalid. They have their domain specific,
No,
like,
and but I mean they're valid. They're internally valid, and I mean they are constructed domains of validity, basically,
yeah,
right? So they can have very very precise conceptions of validity. It's just that they're not universally valid. They're
yeah.
valid, you know, and
But
that's
this is what I was saying too. Like, there's something outside of every rationally constructible
yeah,
system,
yeah.
which is the apprehensive quality of reason itself, which is not explainable by any rational system,
Well,
right?
and that's what you were calling the noetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that is what is the kind of story we could tell about prosaic experience that we were going back to earlier. I'm saying there are different generalizations that we might make on the basis of that when we take into account what inquiry has to say and blah blah blah. And of course, most of inquiry and most of deep physical theory is like way more unitary than I think consciousness is, right? So you could go there and say, oh, look, well, it's proving how. But what we do see is that we get all of these limit cases and problems with all of those theories, and that none of them can contain all of the others, and that each of them has a problem about its own conditions of genesis. And specifically, when you enter an evolutionary domain like cosmology, you hit those limits because you're like, oh, here's a question that I can't ask in terms of this theory. So
Mm.
I'll need to deviate this theory and ask a question about the conditions of genesis of the world basically that corresponds to this theory. By doing that, I'll need to go outside this theory and admit other kinds of reasoning. And it just tends to be the case that those are just evolutionary modes of reasoning, right? They're questions
But
about.
if but you're when you're saying going out of a domain and
Yeah,
like uh
yeah,
constructing other domains, I'm not
yeah,
saying going to another domain at
yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
And I'm saying this is something that like exists within those domains, although it's like a hyperaxiom or something like that. It's
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah,
it's never axiomatized
yeah.
and maybe can't be axiomatized. I don't know if I mean
Well, I
potentially
think that's abduction, right? Like abduction can't be. Abduction is the kind of the condition of possibility of the genesis of a novel locus or a novel
yeah,
domain,
beautiful.
but
Yeah.
it cannot be axiomatized. It is the part, and this is a real, like Peirce does try in a way to axiomatize it at times, and there's a whole kind of, literature on attempting to include abduction within logic. But I think I'm no Peirce scholar. I'm no scholar of any kind. I'm just a dude, you know. Um,
Not true, but yeah.
well, ask me about Venom or something, or
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
questions in musicology. There are things that I know quite a lot about. The rest, I'm just bullshit. Um, but I think he comes more and more to realize, and actually, this leads him in a very theological direction, right? Ultimately,
Mm,
but that this is not axiomatizable, but it's something we can rely on in a way, right? Like you can rely, like I said, like if you're in a dark room and you start flailing
yeah,
around randomly, you probably hit a wall.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that's how you abduce,
yeah,
right? You can abduce an orientation, which is why, again, orientation may not be fundamental because abduction is the genesis of an orientation. But it's the condition of the possibility of any locus, but it is not contained within the loci. And again, I would just say that abduction is a way of thinking about what Darwin was thinking about. It's the same thing. It's
yeah.
about
I mean, it's the same natural selection question
yeah,
as well, and it's the Hume question with habit. Like
yeah,
Hume, like habit's this irrational thing that doesn't have a basis, and without it, we don't get reason. But it
yeah,
does ground reason, and
yeah,
irrationally so,
yeah,
and all of this. But what is habit too? Like habit is a living thing, and he
yeah,
tries to
yeah,
physicalize it at times, but
yeah,
also
yeah,
keeps it like a subjective thing. And I would say there's like a noetic within it. There is this apprehension of a towardsness of experiencing of something.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, just on the human habit thing, Jay Garfield, who's mostly known as a Buddhist scholar, who now lives in Tasmania, and
Hmm.
I'm happy to go and visit him soon
Oh
in
right,
Tasmania.
yeah, yeah, nice.
But he wrote a book years ago, I think around like 2018 or something, called The Concealed Influence of Custom. It's like a
Hmm.
big book on Hume.
Yeah,
Uh, and I read the introduction. He sent me the pre-publication
nice.
proofs. I read the introduction and I was like filled with enthusiasm. And I think I sent him some like really gushingly enthusiastic emails about how this was really should be generalized into an evolutionary metaphysics or something. And he was like,
Yeah,
"Oh, Tim, there are devils in the details, and we kind of
yeah.
never." And I'm like, I know, but we never really pursued that. And I mean, we almost haven't spoken since until recently. But anyway, that book is about the influence of common law on Hume's conception of habit, right? Um, and basically, I was kind of saying that, yeah, these customs, that's just what physical law and all that is like too. These are customs. I was in a more obviously Persian and even Whiteheadian and whatever
Yeah, yeah.
process relational metaphysics kind of register. But yeah, no, I think Hume is in that ballpark as well at times. And obviously he gives that proto natural selection account in is it the Inquiries,
Mm,
and then kind of doesn't pursue it.
hmm.
But yeah, it's just like there is concrete possibility, which is undirected variation, and that is the most general thing. Um, but things within that can somehow bump into each other in a way, like they can constitute enough quasi unity,
Yeah,
like quasi boundaries or something, that they can create tensions or gradient, and now we're in an analogical space
of
where
course.
we're
Yeah,
with Simondon, and we're trying to talk about things that look a bit like this in domains that we can actually characterize, that themselves, of course, need to take a lot of things for granted. But basically, metaphysically, we're saying there's just concrete possibility, and somehow it dissociates, it twists, like the Bergson account,
Mhm.
and interacts with itself, but it's not an it's not a self, it's not an entity, it's not a locus, it's not a unity. Contingently quasi-unities will have to form, and then by interacting and pushing against each other, they will become unities,
Mm.
basically, and that's individuation, right? But let me say so that we can finish.
Mm.
There's a quote that I want to read from your paper,
Okay.
a very brief one. It's just the whole issue we've been discussing, and then I just want to quickly say something about fiction, and it's really the thing we've been saying the whole time. I just want to say it's the same, it's very similar in world building, and also concretization in Simondon, and that could be, we don't need to deal with all of that now, but that's something we can talk about another time.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you say, you know the discovery of operative ideality in life is the gateway to latent intelligibility, and as soon as a drop of essentiality is admitted, suddenly the whole infinitely complex and interconnected realm of intelligibles appears necessary. I think, in a way, we've been problematizing that phrasing, but what I will say is that when you constitute a domain or a world with enough consistency, right,
Mm.
um, it suddenly makes it possible for you to discover things in that world, that it feels like you didn't invent, right? So this is the way in which mathematics, which again, I always have to say this, derives its consistency from the empirical world in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So real people solving real problems in actual material empirical circumstances derive modes of consistency, or
Yeah.
axioms,
Yeah.
systems of,
Yeah.
and then they have consequences that extend beyond the domains in which they're originally applied. And eventually you construct this mathematical landscape, which seems to radically exceed the physical
Mm.
landscape,
Mm.
is entirely derived from it. And then we go like, oh, it's not derived from it. And it's like, no, it's in a very concrete, unless you already a priori think mathematics is
Mm.
metaphysics.
Mm.
Um, I mean, and a lot of people think that, but that's an assumption, right?
Yeah.
That's an assertion that you make. If you don't make that assertion, it's just literally, if maths is like a way of reasoning with great precision about things, it's all derived from the empirical in that sense, right?
Mm.
But in a way, in a constructive mode of generalization and imagination, which is obviously going to feel like construction. Sorry, is going to feel like discovery
Yeah.
and not invention, because as soon as you put down a couple of ideas and you demand that they be consistent with each other, they have consequences that you
Yeah.
didn't plan in them. That's just how it feels to create a world, or write a piece of music, actually. But create a world in fiction, right? And you don't have to say much. I mean, often, because you borrow so much from like experience in the real world, you could just say like, Tom was a nice person, and then you can start telling a story where Tom, meets another person. And there's a whole range of behavior which Tom isn't going to do because Tom's a nice, but you already characterized him
Yeah.
as consistent. But, obviously, if you're a fantasy author like a Tolkien or whatever, you start building elements of this world. And for Tolkien, it begins with linguistic consistency. So he's doing all this philology and like inventing languages and then trying to like retroactively justify their etymology, or,
Yeah.
like he's doing this radical constructive thing. And then he's saying, and then he's deriving worlds, or a world, from Arda, not just Middle Earth, but the Earth, from those, and it feels like to him, of course, that he's discovering all of these things, right?
Mm. Mm.
And he legitimately is, like, he's not inventing every detail, but he created a system with enough consistency that it contained implicit details that then he renders explicit
Yeah.
by moving through the world and going, oh, what happens when, so and so encounters so and so at the crossroads of blah blah blah, and that's amazing and wonderful, and I love it. But to confuse that, like Hegel does, with all of reality or something like that, that's the
Mm.
hypostatic move that I don't
Yeah.
want to make, that I don't
Yeah.
want White to be making. Um,
Yeah.
and then blah 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 blah. There's a great like Simondon can be very Hegelian at times, and much more Hegelian than he realizes. And I think that there
Yeah.
is a reparative reading, and I don't know that it's really been done.
Mm.
I mean, there's a whole thing, and I mean, I'm not the scholar to do it. I'm not a scholar to do it, but it's like read Wall and Kojève and Hippolyte and all these people, and all the whole French reception of
Right.
Hegel, and then go back to Hegel and read Hegel really closely. And my intuition, my suspicion is that a lot of the problems that they have with Hegel will still be real problems, like there
Yeah.
are real with Hegel, but at the same time, they'd be able to more precisely specify some of the things that they are dealing with in a positive sense if they went to Hegel, who actually was dealing with a lot of those ideas, like in a very rich and developed way
Yeah.
before that. That there's too much rejection going on in a way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
anyway,
I mean, Hegel does have this like dynamic sense of abductive variation,
yeah,
essentially going on, and I mean, it is the motor
yeah,
that keeps the phenomenology at least
yeah,
moving
yeah,
and like folding in on itself and creating something new out of
yeah,
itself. And that kind of temporal orientation to that unfolding. Now he might botch that later, but he does give voice to this, and so I think that like Hegel's I mean, you could see Hegel as having continuity with Bergson, even though Bergson
oh, I think so.
would not want would probably not want. I mean, he's French in this way that he just
Yeah,
hates
yeah,
all the
yeah.
German philosophers, but
Yeah. There's a whole conversation we could now have about Debussy and Wagner, but let's not.
yeah,
That would be a great, that would be a fun conversation for us to have, and we should do some of these dialogues about music. But um, concretization in Simondon, right,
yeah,
is basically like once you have a technical schema that is invented, right, it has a kind of absolute origin to it, but it's invented in association with a particular finality. Like you want to do something, and you have a particular understanding of the world, like and he's all about the relationship between like scientific schemas and technical schemas and all of that, right? You know something about the world, you want to intervene in the world in a certain way, you build this thing, where you come up with a schema, and then you materialize the schema, you
yeah,
construct it, and then it's never perfect, right? But because you have already created something with sufficient consistency and an orientation, so it's kind of like a complex way of abducing something and going like, this is now the new object in the world, and it has its own logic. Well, it has its own logic, and that concretization is a kind of fulfillment of
yeah,
the initial finality and logic of the invention, and
yeah.
the rest of it is not part of the invention and is basically discovered, right?
Mm.
It's only when you put the thing into the world and it starts interacting and doing things that you're like, oh, this bit doesn't, blah 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 blah.
Yeah. Well, and
But
there's
you've got,
always underdetermination in the
yeah,
structure and these
yeah,
things, but he does use the term technical essence. And
yes,
it is essentially just constraints doing work. Because
yeah,
like he'll give these examples of like steam engines and like, we can have a steam engine and an internal combustion engine and like, I don't know, a piston, like whatever. They're all using something similar. If you
yeah,
constrain a bunch of air and
yeah,
pressurize it
yeah,
and then channel that pressure, it can do work, which is
yeah,
exactly the same thing. Like if you like, there are vast amount of constraints possible within a given physical system. I mean, different physical systems with different complexity have more or less constraints, whatever you want to say. But there's a way of configuring the constraints such that work can be done that's
yeah.
predictable. Like that is the essence of technical essences. If I was gonna, if I was gonna
Well,
name one,
yeah. I mean, so I think Simondon does want to say there is no essence of the engine, for example, because
there's no
that,
essence of the engine for
yeah,
sure. And this
yeah,
is the Rie, like this is the beautiful solution. And we're gonna have to get into this next
yeah,
time
yeah,
because I do need to
yeah.
go to bed soon. But I mean, there is no essence of engine, but
Yeah,
there is an essence of technicity, if you will, which is to say that constraints, constrained in the right way, can
yeah.
do work that is predictable in a way that we would say that it's work in a proper sense of the word.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the essence of technicity is a certain finality. It is an intervention in the world that deviates.
Which is the less than the whole because it can do more than
Yeah,
like
it's a
like we want the engine to do one thing, but it can explode or it can
yeah, 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 yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
And of course, I mean, this would be there's a whole conversation here about that relation between, technical essences and effective theories and abstraction and stuff, and the way, and this is the Kungiem line also that Simondon develops, like the derivation of the notion of a mechanism from the organism,
Mm,
essentially, the abstraction of something
yeah.
from organisms, making them way more precise and screening
Mm,
out all the noise and making them
yeah, yeah.
reliable, doing all of that but then going back and trying to understand the organism in terms of that thing,
Right,
which
right,
was
right.
abstraction, blah
Yeah.
blah blah. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's about controlling noise and creating reliability. And this is why the artisanal metaphysics, this is like a huge jump, but and some would accuse Aristotle of this, but that's another discussion, right? But the artisanal metaphysics is all a radical kind of misunderstanding in a way, right? And that's where we get the necessitarian and all this stuff. Is like when we make things, we want them to be as, necessitarian, as deterministic as possible.
Hmm.
Condition of the making of them in the first place, which at some level involves this abduction,
Yeah.
cannot itself be described in those terms. So you
Yeah.
can't submit all of reality to that. And blah, 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 blah. That's why, yeah, I don't think all of reality is intelligible.
Mm,
Because I think that our model of intelligibility is this kind of making model. It is like Feynman or someone would
yeah.
say, like Baker's knowledge kind of thing. And we understand because of modern science and the process of precisely defining degrees of freedom and bases of reduction in effective theories, we should, I think, have come to a better understanding, or at least this philosophy is what we need to be doing, I think, because it doesn't come out of science directly, because that, well, at least the metaphysics of scientism is like, oh, look, we demonstrated mastery. That is the nature of reality. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, no, no. But we need to retrospectively also critique the history of philosophy, including Whitehead, for the way in which this capacity to specify
Mm,
things, forms of definiteness, and all of that cannot itself be ultimate. But if eternity just means necessity associated with a particular domain, fine. Like, I don't have a problem with that. It's not the way I would use
yeah.
the term, but that would be to invite misunderstanding in a contemporary discourse,
Mm,
in my opinion, right? But we always have that problem in philosophy and metaphysics. And as I've said to Matt many times, some of my problems with Whitehead are just about his decisions to generalize certain terms. And that's a really difficult challenge. Like, when do you
yeah.
generalize a term? When do you rely on a history of usage which is now very anachronistic? So it's
Yeah.
traditional to think of mind in a certain way, but most people today don't think in that way. And when
Yeah.
do you coin a new term? And in all of those ways, like, prehension or something,
Yeah.
I prefer prehension to experience in a certain
Yeah.
way.
Well, and I
Um,
feel like constraint unlocks a lot, like using that instead of eternal object or something like that.
yeah,
Even a,
yeah,
eternal constraint is a
yeah,
step better to in my book, but
yeah. I mean, I like the reliable objects joke, but I said this. I need
yeah,
to email him back to Paul Stenner, who we talked
yeah,
to in an email. I'm way behind in responding to a bunch of my correspondence, but
yeah,
and he's like, oh well, reliability. I can't do reliable objects. I was just joking anyway, but he's like, I can't do reliable objects because reliability is just one value amongst many, and eternal objects contain the whole of value. And I'm like, that's exactly the problem, is saying that you couldn't have a specific value in a way that would be more general and that others could be derived from it. And this is where I actually do think Peirce scores over Whitehead in the way that he treats persistence, because Whitehead's super dismissive of persistence in the
mm,
function of reason.
mm,
And I'm like, what you're not getting, it's not a question. Okay, if you were talking to some reductive, whatever, neo-Darwinian or something, maybe, and they're like, oh, it's all just persistence. It's like, well, that's obviously dumb.
yeah,
Um, yes, of course, organisms, and Darwin himself knew very well, have values other than persistence, right? But that doesn't mean that persistence is not an incredibly general and minimal value from which other values might be derived.
Yeah.
And that's a very different claim. Because things that don't persist, you don't see them, they're gone.
Well, now we're in Kanata's territory.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
But I mean, I would just say, I mean, we could say reliable constraints, but
Yeah,
I'm still in the camp that if they have reliability,
yeah.
even if it's contextual, even if it's always concrete and epochal, that doesn't mean that it's not eternal. It just means that we maybe haven't fully understood what the word eternal means,
And,
and yeah,
and that's fine, and that's fine. And I think one of the problems that I have in this discussion, and I mean it has been a problem between me and Matt quite a bit, I think, is that even though I think I've been consistently saying, yeah, a bunch of the operations or whatever that are attributable to eternal objects, I obviously think are necessary and we should maintain them. Um, any critique I make of eternal objects is seen as like getting rid of the whole thing, and
mm,
then like, but then all we would have is bare actuality or abject flux, and I'm like, that's clearly not my position.
yeah.
Um, that's not what I'm saying.
Well,
But I,
yeah,
yeah,
we'll have to keep hashing it out. I mean, I'm still not convinced of uh, the sempiternal, reliable
fair enough.
constraints.
Fair enough.
Because
We
I
should.
just don't think you get. I don't think. I think constraints are have a genesis,
Yeah,
and I think that we can't understand any constraints other than in the contextual places that they emerge.
yeah.
But I don't think that there can be a uh, constraint that creates constraints unless you have something like eternal objects. And I mean, yeah, we'll
I
talk about
mean,
this. But yeah,
again, I would just say maybe constraint as such, the operation of constraint is one of these minimal. I mean, that's just called selection. So it's like it's part of my minimal schematism. I'm saying that there must be some variational, or let's just say concrete
but I mean,
possibility.
it just comes back to the some constraints are not possible, or like,
Yeah,
and again, we can just say that like you could go again to the necessitarian and just say the only constraints that are real are the ones that actually constrain things, right?
mhm,
But what I'm saying is like there are impossible constraints and there
yeah.
are not impossible constraints. And that means that there's some constraint that stands behind those constraints that has made some impossible and made some not impossible.
Well, I just think impossibility, like possibility, is defined relative to a locus, basically, right? Um, so I mean, this was one of my lectures that I gave for the AHRC course, actually. So I mean,
Nice.
I could send you some of the material and quotes on that. But I
Sweet.
mean,
Yeah.
at least any of our judgments about what's possible and impossible are radically contingent. And what seems impossible from the perspective of any given well-specified effective theory, for example, may turn out to be possible. Like basically life and the course was called Ontogenesis is impossible. Basically life and ontogenesis from the perspective of physical, like the generalization of physical theory in so-called physicalism are impossible. They're clearly possible because they're happening. Um, but so, life, the way life goes, the way concrete possibility operates, maybe, and that could be what Kangiem refers to as the permanent exigency of the living. And he makes the physical, like, derivative in a way from this. That's why he's a vitalist.
Mm.
In a very specific way, that permanent exigency of concrete possibility, which I think is very just consistent with Bergson, surely,
Yeah.
um, that is about change, like constituting and deviating domains of possibility and impossibility. So it is that, and again, that's like creativity in Whitehead. I think it's prior to and more general to again in abstraction. I think we don't disagree on much. And I don't know that it's just terminological, but I think
Yeah.
it's very much. Maybe we pick this up with narrative and concretization.
Yeah.
Maybe next week if you're available, or we
Definitely.
can always intersperse with music conversation.